The Bodyguard story, written by Trevor Rees-Jones with Moira Johnston and read by Mark Baisley. Telling my story in a book is the last thing I ever dreamed I'd be doing. If anyone had suggested it to me in the year after the crash, I'd have said bollocks. From the very beginning, when I was still unconscious in hospital, my family tried to stay out of the limelight. When I woke up, I shared the feeling completely. We decided we'd give no interviews, and in the 2.5 years since the crash, I've given only one, because I felt badly for my employer, Mohammed Al-Fayed, but I regretted it straight away. I began to see that my life could never go back to what it was. How could you be part of such a tragedy with 3 other people in the car killed, one of them the Princess of Wales, and not be changed? They died on my shift, and I'll live with that for the rest of my life. The summer after the crash, Fayed began to attack me, accusing me of betraying him and charging that my actions, or lack of them, had caused the crash. I had to respond. I couldn't let lies be what people believed. Mr. Fayed's attacks weren't the only reason why I finally thought about doing a book. The doctors can't tell me how my health will hold up, or if I'll have a normal span of working years. I've had no compensation of any kind, and my lawyers and family have urged me all along to try to get some recompense for what's happened, to set a little aside for the future in case things turn out badly. I began to see that a book was an honourable way to let me pay my large legal bills and put a little away. And I want to put this behind me. So if anyone wants to know what happened or what I think, it's in here. Finish. My life can move on. This book is the truth, as best I know it, of what happened. The problem was how to tell the story when I was unconscious for a crucial part of it and still have a Swiss cheese memory full of holes for the rest. There were also parts of the story I didn't know, so I and my co-writer, Moira Johnston, decided to write the book in the third person, and I asked my mother and stepdad, Ernie, my lawyers, and my mate Kez to add their memories. Everything here is what I and they believe to be true, to the very best of our knowledge. I can never thank them enough. The presence of the princess on Fayed's yacht Jonicle turned Trevor's job upside down. Trevor was Dodi's man, one-on-one close protection for the son of Mohammed Al-Fayed, the Egyptian tycoon whose acquisition of Harrods had heightened his obsession with winning a British passport and respect from royalty and the establishment. The boss was high profile and controversial and wanted 2-car convoys of armoured Mercedes, but the threat to Dodi was so low that Trevor drove him alone through London. Dodi was anonymous, who'd recognise him, Trevor thought. That, however, was about to change. In the ops room of Fayed's Park Lane office on the 14th of July 1997, with the Fayeds in the south of France with Diana and the princes, and Dodi in Paris, Trevor discovered that Dodi was en route to London and would then hurry south to join the special guests. Trevor would be with him. The bodyguard was delighted. I'd spotted the princess's name, and I thought it would be a hell of an interesting trip to be on. Some lads don't enjoy the longer trips. Stress levels are always higher because the family is expecting perfection on their holiday. With the princess aboard, everything would have to be spot on. That was fine with Trevor, but it had the lads in Saint-Tropez worried. Trevor's mate, Alexander Wingfield, known as Kez, was based at Fayed's villa in France. Since they'd heard the boss had bought a massive yacht, he said, the lads had been thinking, fantastic, we'll be going to see a bit this summer. But when it came through that HRH and her sons were going to be on the trip, what they all thought was, bloody hell, it'll end in tears. With such a high-profile person, the family would be hyper, tempers would be fraying, there'd be a few sackings. But the lads had a saying that let them live with the hazards of working for Fayed. It's paying the mortgage. Trevor had a mortgage too, on a house a few miles from Oswestry. Yet it was Sue, not him, who was living in the house. She had left him in May after just 2 years of marriage, and without Sue to go home to, trips like this were even more appealing. Trevor quickly organised the special gear and Harrods food the family wanted, picked up his radios, mobile phones, pagers and baton, but no gun. Carrying was illegal in England. Trevor dressed and behaved to blend in. He was wearing chinos and a loose shirt that hid the belt full of gear he had to carry. He didn't want his principal to stand out either. In London, I'd call Dodie Sir when I met him in the morning, but if we were with a group of people in a club, I'd be in a suit like him, calling him Dodie. He and Dodie rendezvoused at the Battersea heliport and flew to Stansted, where Trevor called the ops desk at Park Lane to report their arrival, and they took off in Fayed's Gulfstream jet. Mr. Fayed would know his son's movements before they were airborne and expect to be told the moment he landed. He has ultimate control of everything, Al Fayed. Be loyal to the boss and he'll look after you, was the first lesson you were taught. The second was that you never challenged this man's will, even if you were right. At Nice, Trevor drove to the nearby airport of Saint-Laurent-du-Var and boarded Dodie's handsomely converted old torpedo boat, the Cujo. We're starting for Cannes, he informed both the Saint-Tropez base and the Jonical Bridge as they cruised along the coast. The Fayeds and the Princess were on their way to meet them. The Cujo arrived first and moored. Then, moving towards them, they saw a fantastic yacht, impressive even in this playground full of mega-yachts. The Princess wasn't in Dodie's circle of friends, and Trevor had never met her. Now, as he rowed the tender to Fayed's yacht, he spotted her on the rear deck. I was looking for both her and the princes, and when I saw them, it did bring home to me what a big summer this was going to be. It was well known the Princess had dispensed with her own security. She was there as a guest of our family, the Fayeds, and was ours to protect. For this 10-day holiday, they'd be based at the family's cliffside estate at Saint-Tropez, a paradise compound of pools, terraces and gardens where Fayed maintained more than a dozen security personnel. The princes, William and Harry, would have their 2 special branch policemen with them, but Fayed never went out for dinner on these holidays, and since Dodie seemed likely to be taking over the task of escorting the princess, it looked as if Trevor would find himself minding the Princess of Wales. The threat was not the scopes of snipers' rifles, it was the huge telescopic lenses of photographers who could make a fortune from a single intimate shot. No one in his private life, not even his mother, knew Trevor was on the yacht with the Princess. He'd learned in the military to keep work and home life totally separate. Truthfully, a lot of it was not worth talking about. The hazard in civilian security work was not bullets, but boredom. Trevor had loved his work in the 1st Battalion Parachute Regiment in Northern Ireland, covert surveillance with a 4-man team, slipping into an observation post in the hills at night. But after 6 years in the army, Trevor had moved on. He took a fitful stab at college to learn sports physiotherapy, the rebel middle son's way of following the medical careers of his father, a surgeon who had died of a heart attack when Trevor was 17, and his mother, a nursing sister. But the courses weren't what he'd hoped they would be. He'd heard about close protection work from some ex-military lads and thought, it's hands-on, you're thinking as well as being active, I fancy that, as well as the £25,000 a year. He interviewed for the fire job in 1995, and Paul Hanley Greaves, head of personal security at 60 Park Lane, had hired him on the spot. It was like being back in the army, a cracking bunch of blokes, roughly 40, and all ex-military. Trevor clicked straight away. You're doing the same job, you live together, you're playing together. You're all in the same boat, really. It was the same brilliant piss-taking humour that never lets you get away with anything. Trevor and the lads always laughed about the Hollywood view of bodyguards. You're not in a suit and dark glasses, shifting your eyes back and forth looking for assassins to jump out of a doorway, leaping in front of your principal to take a bullet. That's rubbish. That's Hollywood fantasy. Common sense and planning are the best weapons you've got. Kes Wingfield, Trevor's mate and the bodyguard who worked on this trip with him, was a Royal Marines commando. Kes was short and gabby with a passion for horses, while Trevor was a big, steady, husky bloke with a passion for rugby. But Kes agreed with his mate on a bodyguard's role. You need a massive amount of discretion. You're not saving their life like on the telly, you're just trying to make their life flow along smoothly. And you always obey the boss. Working as Dodie's man, you fetched and carried, did menial things. Kelly Fisher would sometimes fly in for a week and Trevor would drive her and Dodie around. She was very attractive. Dodie always met up with attractive women. But the rumour that he was a playboy, I didn't see it. Whoever he met at a nightclub, generally you'd drop Dodie off and then take them home. Everyone I've seen on TV said he was a hell of a good listener. I think he was a good listener because he didn't have much to say for himself. It was Dodie's unpredictability that frustrated. You had your ideal from basic training, four-man teams, time schedules, well-recce'd routes and backup vehicles, but with Dodie, the ideal never happened. The worst of Dodie came out when they were driving, behaviour that becomes significant in hindsight. He'd be sitting in a traffic jam in the middle of the rush hour in London and it would be, "Why have you gone this way?" He hated sitting in traffic, always wanted to push through, to jump lanes, to try to get somewhere more quickly. He'd order me to speed up when I knew a speed camera was coming up. I could lose my licence, my job. I wouldn't do it. Kelly Fisher would later tell a French judge under oath, Trevor was a perfect employee, very strict in his work, but Dodie was a real dictator to him. He did not tell him, "Bring me to this place," but "Bring me to this place, otherwise you are fired." The situation was always very tense and nervous. Trevor agrees, but adds, he was thoughtless to his employees, but he wasn't vindictive. Conversation between them was limited. He wasn't a bloke you could have a chat with, but good grief, I didn't want to be his pal. One thing Dodie didn't fuss about was seatbelts. Neither man really wore them in the city. But if we got on the M4 to Heathrow, a dual carriageway where the road gets quick, seatbelts would go on. Nothing would be said. Dodie would follow Trevor's lead. On Jonicle, Trevor met the Prince's special branch men. "How do I address the Princess?" he asked. "We call her Ma'am," one replied. "What do you call the Princes?" "William and Harry." Well seasoned by round-the-world journeys, the Jonicle had been feverishly refurbished to Fayed's extravagant taste, and with radar, round-the-clock watches and limited access, she was secure. Trevor met the Princess the morning after he arrived. "Hello, Trevor, how are you?" she said, as a team leader introduced him on the beach. In bathing suit and flip-flops, she had the naturalness of someone he might run into in the street in his hometown of Oswestry. "Very well, ma'am, thank you." With the Princes, it was Trevor from the start. "They remember your name. They've got time for everyone. They've been very well brought up. Cracking lads." The running joke would be William and Harry teasing Trevor about his big, bright shirts. This would be a good trip, Trevor sensed. The boss was beaming and exuding bonhomie, clearly pleased to be hosting the Côte d'Azur's catch of the season and, contrary to the lads' expectations, the Fayed children seemed well behaved. For 5 years in Oxted, the main family home in Surrey, Kez's job had been largely with the younger children, the 2 boys and 2 girls he'd watched grow up, indulged and overprotected. Mr. Fayed is paranoid about his children's safety. Fair enough. Kez was sure he loved them, but it stripped them of taking a few knocks and growing up with more responsibility and discipline. And it showed. It was the bodyguards who were forced to take the knocks. Fayed had once handed him £200, a bung after some family fracas, and, says Kez, that was the biggest bung I ever got. Bungs were sweeteners to maitre d's, valets, drivers, and to the bodyguards themselves. They were tips, thank yous for a job well done. On a trip abroad, everyone got £50 if things went smoothly. It was bungs that oiled wheels. As well as bungs, you'd also got floats to cover all your expenses. In London, the secretaries would often give you your bungs and floats, but here, Fayed handed them out in cash himself. On a trip like this, you might start, say, with 400 quid, and it would be gone in no time, says Kez. On the first morning, Trevor walked from the estate down to the beach, a familiar route. He'd been here on 2 previous family holidays and knew the drill. Go down to the beach to help the lads set everything up for the family. This time he was shocked at the number of press boats sitting offshore. Like all French beaches, this one was public, and it was tiny. It was the lads' job to claim it. We put everything out, the jet skis, inflatable toys, beach chairs, umbrellas. The family and royals would turn up at about 10 or 11. In addition to the paparazzi, there were tourists. People would sit on the edge of the beach and just ogle the Fayed encampment, hoping for sightings of the princess. Diana seemed concerned at first with the loss of the privacy and made a much publicized trip out to a paparazzi boat to ask them to give her some peace. She and the boys accommodated the cameras during the day in return for peaceful nights. Debbie Gribble, the Jonicle's chief stewardess, has been widely quoted as seeing the seeds of romance planted the very first night Dodie and Trevor boarded. As tall and slim as the princess, this lively, athletic New Zealander had orchestrated the serving of a feast on the aft deck prepared by 4 chefs, each serving up his specialities. According to the News of the World, it was at this meal that she saw a full-blown food fight between Dodie and Diana, and then destiny as something passed between them. I never said it, Debbie states. In my mind, both families were thoroughly enjoying themselves, eating, drinking, and watching the firework display. There may have been a photographer's boat around, and Dodie, I think, started hurling fruit from the elaborate fruit platters at them. This, in turn, began a free-for-all, with both lots of children and Diana and Dodie in on it. I never saw any canoodling that night. Sometimes Trevor minded the children during the day, but that was basically Kez's job. Trevor's was organising the nightlife. There'd usually be the royal party of 3, plus Dodie, Fayed's wife, and the 2 elder Fayed girls, Camilla and Jasmine, plus 3 or 4 of us security lads, and the prince's police. We'd generally drive in, then walk through Saint-Tropez. They'd be in the most casual kit, jeans, trousers and shorts, but you can't be low profile when you're a dozen people, most of them big men. Ashore, the streets were crowded, and the princess got noticed, but no one pestered her. One of the policemen and I would drive out beforehand to plan the evening, Trevor recalls. We'd recce the roads, routes, hospitals, possible venues for little adventures, walks, window shopping. The first restaurant we checked was about half an hour's drive out of town. We liked it and got it all booked up. Trevor bunged the maitre d' £100 to assure good care for his unnamed party that night. On the way back, Trevor spotted a fairground set up along the road. He noted it as a point of interest they might want to stop at after dinner. They worked out how to get into the grounds, checked on admission prices and whether there was secure parking. We had 4 or 5 security at the restaurant that night. We sat with the prince's policemen on the terrace outside. And what surprised me was how relaxed they were with the princes and princess. William and Harry came out of the restaurant and I chatted away with them. The police did not cramp. They kept their distance and let their charges enjoy themselves. We popped into the funfair after dinner. It was a very relaxed atmosphere that night. With the princess and the boys along, Trevor noticed a whole new mood. I always thought that their presence brought out the best in the family we work for. There didn't seem to be any backbiting. Our family is quite demanding, you know. If you're not there at their beck and call, they tend to throw their teddy bears out of the pram. The princess and her boys created a much lighter atmosphere, and if Fayed wasn't there, which he never was in the evenings, things were a hell of a lot easier. We trod on eggshells when he was around. Some of the lads reported that the princess wasn't always this good-natured, that she could get hacked off at times as well. But you couldn't fake what Trevor saw as her chirpy, very bubbly, very easygoing personality for 10 consecutive days, with the makeup off, the glamour and formality stripped away, in front of bodyguards she didn't need to impress. She was chatty, and Trevor was not going to just stand there and say nothing. He glimpsed a serious side to Diana when she received word of the murder of her good friend, the fashion designer Gianni Versace, on 15th of July. She was talking about how she had to fly to the funeral and how sad she was. She was pretty down about it. But it was mostly an upbeat princess Trevor and Kez remember. She used to take the mickey out of things I'd wear, Kez laughs. I had this really big pair of shorts. She'd say, "Couldn't you get any in large?" Since the accident, Fayed has painted a picture of family bliss, saying that Diana found real happiness on her holiday with his normal family. But Dodie was playing a secretive game with his girlfriend Kelly Fisher. As she would later tell a French judge, Dodie had flown her to Saint-Tropez on the 16th of July. There, he kept her hidden on the family's boats while he spent his days with the royal guests. There was a rumour going around among the lads that Dodie's girlfriend was on the Cujo, Trevor confirmed, but I never saw Kelly Fisher. Debbie Gribble did. I met Kelly Fisher one afternoon when Dodie, Kelly and another chap came on board Jonicle for a very late lunch. It was quite obvious that she was upset over something. Debbie confirms that Dodie did go over to the Cujo on occasion, but he slept on the Jonicle. Annoyed as she may have been by Dodie's excuses for hiding her away, Kelly would claim to know nothing of Dodie and Diana's growing friendship until she saw their pictures splashed across the papers in Los Angeles several weeks later. Michael Cole, Fayed's PR man, made contact with the publicist Max Clifford to help manage the explosive potential of the Kelly-Fisher affair once Fayed had seized upon the possibility of a romance between Dodie and the princess. Clifford admitted to the journalist Martin Gregory that he had tipped off certain photographers and press people to the couple's whereabouts as the romance progressed. Kelly was not part of the larger agenda. To Trevor's mind, Dodie's efforts to promote a romance with Princess Diana got off to a stumbling start. After dinner one evening, Dodie suddenly led the troupe to a nightclub which Trevor didn't have time to recce, a little cellar club on the back alley just off the waterfront. It was dingy. Dodie obviously knew the owner from his years of socializing in Saint-Tropez, and the owner was overjoyed. But Trevor cringed. Dodie had rented the whole place to protect their privacy, and the little group sat alone on the dance floor, sipping their drinks. They danced a bit in this empty, tacky little place. It was such an embarrassingly sterile environment. What a way to impress a princess. But there was no question that the princess and Dodie were enjoying talking to each other. I was surprised. Actually, as personality-wise, I'd have put the princess and Dodie poles apart. The princess and princes flew home on Sunday the 20th of July, where they separated, with the princess going to Balmoral to spend August with their father. As Diana attended Gianni Versace's funeral in Milan on the 22nd of July, Dodie and Kelly cruised the Mediterranean. They flew to Paris on the 23rd of July, before Kelly returned to Los Angeles, expecting to marry Dodie in August. Yet the word spread through the staff that Dodie and the princess were becoming an item. Certainly Debbie was convinced that at least a summer romance was underway. But Kez says, once our team got to know her and the princes better, any speculation that she and Dodie were having a romance was just met with derision. Trevor could not believe there could ever be a romance. What the 10 days had clearly shown Trevor was the differences between the two families. When Trevor heard Fayed's statements later about how Diana had found in the Fayeds a normal family she could relate to and be comfortable with, the normal family she'd never had, he responded, "Rubbish. Normal families I know don't have a holiday with royalty, don't own villas in Saint-Tropez, and don't have 50-yard yachts. Normal families I know go on holiday to Mallorca with inflatable lilos." What he took away from the trip was the scene the media never saw, the visits to the fun fair. The princess, untroubled by photographers, wandering around, joking, exploring with her sons, probably the last relaxed and happy time she would ever have with William and Harry. Once they'd gone to Balmoral, she would never see them again. Trevor returned to work on the 6th of August after 10 days' leave to find his job as Dodie's man transformed. The anonymous man he'd driven alone around London had been thrust into the limelight. Now, Trevor would be running the gauntlet of the paparazzi with the Princess of Wales. As he checked in for his first shift, Dodie and the princess were just returning from Sardinia, the second of 2 trips they'd taken together since returning from Saint-Tropez. I was absolutely gobsmacked when I found out they'd been on holiday together. Mid-evening on the 7th of August, a big BMW pulled up outside Dodie's apartment at 60 Park Lane. From security cameras, Ops had reported photographers milling at the front and side entrances. Trevor saw the princess arrive with only a driver and no security whatsoever. Flash bulbs started popping as he dashed to the rear right door and blocked for the princess as this breathtaking woman emerged from the back seat, still suntanned from the Côte d'Azur, all legs and high heels in a very glamorous, skin-tight, short blue cocktail dress. Pictures of the princess wearing the blue dress and a smile of shy anticipation would be all over the papers the following morning. One of the most glamorous of all shots taken during the romance. Taking Diana home that night was Trevor's first London drive with the princess. The garage doors opened to a chaotic scene. Photographers everywhere. Flashbulbs blinding you, cameras whacking against the windows. According to reporters, a car ran over the foot of a photographer, though Trevor saw nothing of the incident. They were jumping out at us. If it happened, I'm sorry it happened. Trevor directed the driver towards Kensington High Street, then into the long driveway that leads to Kensington Palace and the entrance on Palace Avenue. They zoomed up the driveway with photographers waiting at the gate, but halted finally by the signs, no admittance, private road, no unauthorized parking, and by the security barrier. As the guard, who had never seen Trevor before, said a very formal, "Good evening, sir," The princess wound the window down, poked her head through the glass and said, "It's only me." The barrier opened, the guard waved them through, and an ebullient princess called back, "Good night, Trevor, see you tomorrow," as she ran up the steps of the white column portico and vanished through the palace door. From then on, anywhere Dodie and the princess went would be under siege. The threat assessment for Dodie had just gone up tenfold. They had to scale up security. Just as the paparazzi were smelling blood, Diana left the next day, the 8th of August, on a short trip to Bosnia to protest against the use of landmines. But the media excitement so far was just a calm preamble to what was to come on the day of Diana's return. On the couple's recent trip on the Jonicle, one photographer, Mario Brenner, had found the yacht in a remote bay off Sardinia and brought his powerful telephoto lens to bear on two bathing-suited bodies in an intimate moment on the deck. The image Brenner got was hazy. It was hard to tell whether it was an embrace or a kiss. But for Brenner, it was a shot worth at least $1 million. And on Sunday morning, the 10th of August, the photo, exclusive in the Sunday Mirror, hit the newsstands with the nearly 2-inch high headline, "The Kiss," and subhead, "Locked in her lover's arms, the princess finds happiness at last." Even Dodie seemed now to grasp the implications for his previously private life. René Delorme, his royal butler, was called over from Paris. It was clear that the couple would increasingly be eating in. René had learned over his 7 years of running Dodie's households in Beverly Hills, Paris, and now London, to create the romantic aura Dodie liked, with every detail perfect. René was the sentimental impresario who orchestrated the silver, the crisp linen, the candles, caviar, the background music, the favorite wines and cigars, the stage set on which Dodie had entertained a host of Hollywood stars, from Brooke Shields to Julia Roberts. Trevor's problem was still Dodie's unpredictability. Unknown to Trevor, Dodie had devised a plan to whisk the princess to the fired Surrey estate at Oxted as soon as she returned from Bosnia. By late afternoon on the 10th of August, the couple, Trevor and René, were travelling around the M25 to the estate where Firehead had created an English country dream. Gorgeous green landscapes of fields with grazing horses and flowering gardens surrounded a massive Elizabethan mansion. Firehead ran his empire in all except the most bitter weather from a white tent set out on the lawn. It seemed a British version of the Sheikh's desert tent, but its purpose was less romantic. Its isolation prevented bugging. René, for this overnight stay, masterminded wine and caviar under a marquee in a sort of secret garden far from the house, and then a candlelit dinner. Security plans at Park Lane were now stepped up. Hoping to confuse the press, they left Park Lane in 2-car convoys. 2 vehicles, both with darkened windows, hoping they wouldn't know which one the couple was in. We made sure it was the last minute before the garage doors went up. Our cameras were covering South Street and all the junctions, so you're on the radio to the ops room, them telling you it's clear so you'd be able to shoot straight out. But getting the princess from Kensington Palace to Park Lane without being hounded by press cars required more resourcefulness. I'd phoned her driver on his pager, and we'd arranged to meet at some quiet street. Our driver and I would be in a Toyota people carrier. We'd make sure no paparazzi were following us. We'd arrive, park, and he'd ring us when he was approaching. He'd pull up, she'd get out of her car and straight into ours, and we'd drive off. I can't remember whether it was my idea or hers, the ducking down, but it became their routine. As Trevor approached the Park Lane garage, he'd be on the radio to the lads, and the guy at the desk would call down to the car. "The road's clear now, still clear," so we could come straight across and into the garage. As we were approaching South Street, I'd say, "Duck down now, Ma'am, we're nearly there." She'd slip down to the floor, often laughing, just as they were pressing the button to open the garage door. Timing was critical. When the photographers saw the door slide up, they'd be ready to pounce. The driver would shoot down the ramp past the photographers with no princess in sight, the doors closed like a portcullis. She'd see it as a bit of a joke. She used to laugh about it. I think she was enjoying herself. The pull of privacy and romance at Oxted was so strong that Dodie and the princess soon returned, starting with a venture launched by Dodie with such flagrant disregard for security that, for Trevor, frustration was replaced by shock. As he and Dodie arrived at the Battersea heliport to meet the princess, Trevor was told the plans had changed. The couple were going somewhere else first, and he was excluded. "I think I should be with you for this," said Trevor, as Dodie and the princess happily climbed aboard the helicopter. "You're not needed. We'll meet you at Oxted," said Dodie. On the spur of the moment, Dodie was literally taking off on his own without a bodyguard or backup. Appalled but helpless, Trevor called the ops room and said that Dodie had departed on a helicopter with his guest to an unknown destination. The pilot had no idea where the couple were going either until they were airborne. In fact, Diana was taking Dodie to visit Diana's psychic, Rita Rogers, in Derbyshire, and if secrecy was Dodie's goal, it was a fiasco. The pilot didn't know what he was looking for or where to land, and Diana was having difficulty identifying Rogers' house. The clattering green and beige helicopter, quickly recognized as belonging to Harrods by anyone who'd seen a newspaper in the past 2 weeks, hovered low above a housing estate while the three of them sorted it out. By the time it set down in a nearby field, a crowd of excited housewives had gathered, taking home videos that appeared on the evening news. They were spotted too as they arrived back at Oxted. Paparazzi had their telephoto lenses set up on the high ground behind the estate. Trevor groaned when he heard where they'd been. But it seemed as if they were playing games at that stage, really, enjoying themselves. And if Trevor's job was really about making life run smoothly for your principals, he was doing quite well. The couple were getting on very well. There were no overt displays of affection in public. But they seemed very close. They did seem to be enjoying each other's company. Suddenly, for Trevor, the action stopped. On the 15th of August, the princess flew to Greece for a long-planned cruise with her good friend, Rosa Monckton. Dodie flew to Los Angeles, no doubt partly to try to calm Kelly Fisher after her press conference. Her celebrity feminist attorney, Gloria Allred, declared that Kelly learned about Mr. Fayed's betrayal from the kiss photo. She threatened to sue for breach of contract. Kelly would later tell a French judge that our relationship lasted until August 7th. Until then, she claimed, the marriage was planned for August 9th. Everything was fine. I had Dodie on the phone every day until the photographs of Dodie and Diana were published in the press. Trevor learned the couple would be leaving on the 21st of August for another trip on the Jonicle. It would be just the two of them for the 10 days. Kes will be coming, Trevor was told. That's all? He asked, astounded. I need more. One person's not enough to look after two people with the romance out in the news. Kes picked up several £100 of bungs from Fayed for what he'd been informed would be just a 3-day trip. He hadn't been asked. He'd been told he was going and was feeling a bit disgruntled since his leave was overdue. He'd also been told that he and Trevor would be the sole security aboard the Jonicle. We'll need a few more blokes, sir, Kes respectfully said. No. We're going to keep it low-key, Fayed insisted. I just want to make sure they have a good time. How a man so obsessed with security could reduce it to such low levels for his son and the Princess of Wales was beyond Kes. Still, it was only 3 days. With Trevor handling the luggage at the airport, Kes greeted the princess at the tender. Good evening, Mom. It's nice to see you again. Her reply, Hello, Kes, how are you, was as friendly as ever. Moments later, Dodie turned to Kes and ordered, Kill that motherfucker, as he spotted a photographer on the dock. Kes was shocked. Dodie had hurled this crude bomb right in front of the princess, and the trip had not even begun. But the princess ignored Dodie's words and boarded the tender with unruffled poise. Kes went across to the photographer and said in a fierce whisper the princess couldn't hear, Piss off, which he did. The Jonicle motored south, dropping anchor at nearly 2 a.m. near Saint-Tropez. The next morning they set off to Pamplona Bay, the closest place to the family's villa a tender could land without using the villa's tiny exposed beach. Trevor was told by Luigi del Tevere, the Jonicle's captain, that the couple were going to the villa. Trevor dashed to join them, but was told by Dodie he wasn't needed. He watched them taken ashore in the tender, with 2 paparazzi boats following. 3 hours later, the couple stepped back aboard. This time there had been 7 paparazzi boats. As they departed Pamplona Bay, Trevor and Kes were on their own, sole security for a woman whose every move was worth a fortune to the photographers. Trevor was in charge, and he had no idea where they were going. Secrecy was the Fayed pattern, Debbie confirms. In true Fayed style, no one was ever to know a thing about any plans. A relentless fleet of press boats would follow them, yet Trevor felt optimistic. After London, he was confident in handling the paparazzi. The best thing to do, he'd learned, was to chat with them and try to get some cooperation. You don't want to make enemies of them. My personal opinion was that it was controllable, Kes agreed. The second night out, he and Trevor volunteered for an additional job, night watch. This meant checking the anchor line, scanning radar triangulation of fixed points to make sure the boat was not drifting, fire watch, and patrolling the decks. They'd be doing the night shift from midnight to 4 a.m., with one of them sleeping in the captain's chair on the bridge for 2 hours while the other patrolled. Part of the night we had no security awake at all. There were only the two of us, and we needed to be lively in the day. We were working 18-hour days most of the time, a whole day's work, then the night shift, sleep for a short while, then be up for the day, Trevor says. The Princess appeared on deck each morning around 8, before Dodie. She'd see Kes scanning the paparazzi and say, "How many today, Kes?" You'd pass her the binoculars and she'd have a look and you'd be laughing and joking about it. On occasion, she was giggling and waving. Dodie was not as relaxed. As the Jonicle departed Saint-Tropez on the 23rd of August, 3 yachts followed them. "Trailing us like sharks," Kes observed, and Dodie wanted to outrun them. That afternoon, the Jonicle moored at Saint-Jean-Cap-Ferrat, just west of Monte Carlo, with 2 paparazzi boats anchored nearby. And that evening, Dodie pulled a spur-of-the-moment walkabout in Monte Carlo. Trevor had no time to find hospitals, liaise with police, plan a route. It was a security shambles. But it was their holiday, and he'd just get on with it. Luigi manoeuvred the tender towards a discreet side of the harbour under the cover of darkness, where the 5 of them, Dodie, Diana, the 2 bodyguards and Renee the butler, began walking towards the town. Then Diana gasped, "Oh my God," as she spotted the paparazzi dead ahead. So we turned back towards the tender, speeding up to a run, and jumped back on. Luigi scooted to the other side of the harbour, and they walked briskly into the anonymity of the streets. The Princess's pace quickened with the exhilaration of freedom. She walked straight up the steep streets of Monte Carlo, perfectly comfortable, while Dodie struggled alongside. They were chatting away, Trevor noted, amused. But Dodie was puffed because he wasn't very fit. The 5 of them strode past shops, squares, cafes and bars, peeked in a few, but retreated when the Princess was recognised. Dodie didn't seem to have a clue where he was going. Trevor kept thinking, Dodie didn't want to stop anywhere. He seemed so worried about them being recognised, so fearful they'd be hassled. And the Princess was striding out, and they just kept walking and walking and walking. Diana seemed to be revelling in this rare taste of unplanned freedom, and the walk was fast becoming a route march. As they broke onto the main road out of Monte Carlo, the road sign gave the number of kilometres to France. They were walking to France. "Where are we?" Dodie asked as they stumbled on a bus stop. They'd lost sight of the harbour, and here they were, the targets of every tabloid photographer in the world, totally lost, huddled at a bus stop, trying to read the map in the dim streetlight. As a professional, Trevor was appalled. But suddenly the Princess started giggling. "You have to laugh, don't you?" says Trevor. "There's myself and Kes, and a butler, and you have the most famous woman in the world trying to find out where she is in Monte Carlo at a bloody bus stop. I mean, it's a joke, isn't it?" She was giggling at Dodie getting them lost, and at the adventure of it. Dodie led the procession downhill towards a beach hotel he seemed to remember. A straggling retreat from Moscow, in Kes's view. Things went silent between the couple. We got to the hotel, gagging for a drink of water. I thought they'd go in while we organised a pickup. Instead, Dodie sat outside on the wall and ordered the bodyguards to go get a bottle of Evian water from the hotel manager. While others dined and parted inside, the Princess waited outside, giving Trevor another glimpse of how limiting her life really was. Trevor phoned Luigi. He would be over to pick them up if they could get the gate to the beach open. It was locked for the night. As Trevor and Kes sat on the wall, sharing a bottle of water, waiting for the hotel manager to find the night security man to open the gate to the beach and the jetty, Kes remarked that if he'd tried to show his girlfriend a good time like that, he'd have been dumped on the spot. Since the crash, this walk in Monte Carlo has taken on greater significance. At least 2 Diana books and any number of newspaper stories claim, variously, that on the 22nd or 23rd of August, the couple went ashore at Monte Carlo, visited the Reposi jewelry store they had first visited on the 5th of August, ordered a $200,000 emerald and diamond ring, and arranged to have Alberto Reposi deliver it to Paris on the 30th of August. This was the famous engagement ring Dodi was reportedly planning to give Diana the night they died. The ring may be real, but no, says Trevor emphatically. There was no visit to Reposi on this trip. Kes confirms that the couple never went into a jewelry store. The story, Trevor suspects, was circulated to promote the romance. This became explosive as Fayed made the Monte Carlo shopping trip for the ring during the final Jonical voyage, not only proof of Diana's plans to marry his son, but the centerpiece of his assassination theory, naming the British government, Prince Philip, Camilla Parker Bowles, and Trevor among the perpetrators. Although ring stories appeared within days of the crash, it was not until February 1998, in an interview in the Mirror, that Fayed claimed that by the day of the crash, Diana had accepted Dodi's proposal and Dodi had planned to present the engagement ring to Diana when they arrived back at his apartment. Fayed claims he paid for the stunning engagement ring, selected a week before the crash at the exclusive Reposi jewelry store in Monte Carlo. In the spring of 1999, Fayed would tie the ring directly to his assassination theory, revealing the plot to the Daily Star. Diana and Dodi were set to announce their engagement on Monday, the 1st of September. The CIA found out by bugging Diana's call to her pal Lucia Flecha de Lima, wife of the Brazilian ambassador in Washington, on the afternoon of her death. The CIA immediately tipped off Britain's MI6, which unleashed its operatives on the Place del Alma. The plot to kill Diana was kicked into high gear as soon as British authorities found out that Dodi had picked out a ring for his future bride, said the Star. The only reason my son and Diana were in Paris that night was so that he could personally collect the ring and propose to her, Fayed told the Star. But all this was in the future. The Jonical left Monte Carlo and anchored at Portofino, which was swarming with paparazzi. Dodi's getting uptight, Trevor was thinking. He's too desperate to have things go smoothly to impress the princess. Dodi suspected the crew were tipping off the press. The yacht manager, Mario, had been fired for allegedly leaking the news of Dodi and Diana's top-secret cruise to Sardinia in early August. Dodi was now asking Trevor, "Why are these paparazzi with us? Do you think Luigi is phoning them?" He suspected everyone. He was seeing ghosts under his bed. As Dodi's growing distrust led him to keep his intentions an even deeper secret from his bodyguards, they recruited 2 of the female crew to report any news they'd picked up about Dodi's plans. Debbie and the Reverend Myra Daniels, Dodi's personal masseuse. Myra, a vibrant young American who described herself as a missionary of natural spiritualism, practiced what Trevor saw as touchy-feely holistic massage and healing. They were the English speakers on the boat. I used Myra a bit because she was a friend of Dodi's. She was helpful. 3 days into the trip, a tender pulled up to the Jonical carrying Stefano, skipper of the Cujo. He told Trevor and Kes, "I'm joining the crew because it's going to be a week's trip." Kes's frustrations rumbled up into black thunder. "We're 2 blokes trying to do more than 2 blokes' jobs. If they can send more crew, they can bloody well send more bodies. Let's ring London now." As Kes remembers it, Trevor got through to the team leader at the ops room. This was the first of 2 calls for help from the bodyguards, calls Fayed's team would claim had never been made. Even the ebullient princess was beginning to show signs of stress from the hounding by the press. She was seen crying in the lounge. Jonical was the only safe haven, but even its secure environment was being breached from within by Dodi. "You might want to know that Dodi's just gone swimming off the back," Debbie informed the bodyguards. Trevor leaped on the tender and maneuvered himself between Dodi and the photographer's boats. It had nothing to do with jumping in front of a speeding bullet. It was the fact that he could drown or get hit by someone on a jet ski going past or anything. The swimming episode was the last straw. Trevor called Fayed's chief of personal security, Paul Hanley Greaves, to complain about Dodi's behavior, hoping it would get back to the boss. in which case he was sure that Dodie would get to hear about it. Debbie had observed some of the side of Dodie that caused the bodyguard such grief, but she viewed the romance through her unique and intimate lens. They weren't openly affectionate, but I did walk into the saloon to turn the lights on and they were kissing. They burst into giggles, but after that incident they didn't seem to care, and to be honest, I tended to ignore it. Annoyed with later reports that she had discussed details of their sleeping arrangements, Debbie says only that they slept in the master stateroom, complete with marble ensuite, 2 twin cabins, dressing room and wardrobes, and master cabin the full width of the yacht, all closed off by a hallway and 2 doors. They used all 3 cabins for luggage, showering, sleeping and dressing. End of story. The crew, especially the personal staff, seemed oblivious of the frustrations of the bodyguards. To Renee, the days were a festival of sunshine, seawater, candlelight and starlight, one indistinguishable from another. End of Side 1. Side 2. At the tiny island of Malara, off Sardinia, Dodie had his first, in Trevor's estimation, brilliant idea of the trip. Late in the evening, with everything set for dinner on board, he told Renee, "The Princess and I have decided to have a barbecue tonight on the beach." Kes had wrecked the site that afternoon, and Dodie had been told it was the most desolate place they'd found yet, but it was secluded and the bleakness would be obscured by the dark. Luigi went ashore first, to light a bonfire on the beach. The first tender went ashore at about 10. Renee in his full butler's gear with black bow tie, and Cristiano in his tall chef's hat. It's like a Monty Python sketch, thought Kes. As the staff set up the barbecue, Renee was in his element. He spread blankets over the area and hid 3 small tables under a damask cloth to create a full-size dining table, aglow with candles. He uncorked Dodie's favourite white Loire wine and served the princess's favourite caviar as Cristiano fired up the coals on the big metal grill. Trevor checked out the periphery. No one could creep up. It was secure. After the couple had eaten, Luigi took the staff back to the boat while the couple stayed on to finish their wine. Only Trevor stayed with them, sitting discreetly in the shadows. All that remained was the bonfire, a bottle of wine, glasses, and Dodie and Diana, Trevor reflects with something uncharacteristically close to sentiment. Dodie had finally done what Trevor called giving a girl a nice time. But looking at her, Trevor marvelled, how in hell has he ever scored with this woman? This beautiful, lively woman he had come to value for her human touch. He'd been close to them for 6 weeks now, and he still would never have put them together in a million years. The peace didn't last for long. 3 times the next day, the 27th of August, helicopters hovered over the yacht, driving the princess from the deck. In a fury, Dodie ordered, "Shoot them down." Next day, ashore, Dodie was recognized for the first time. While Trevor tried to stop the photographer, Dodie vanished, and Trevor had to search the streets to find him. Both Trevor and Kes agreed that if Dodie and the princess did get together, it would be a recipe for disaster security-wise. As they dropped anchor at Cala di Volpe, an elegant and private Sardinian resort, the couple seemed restless. The bodyguards could sense that the holiday was reaching its natural conclusion. On Friday, the 29th of August, there was a buzz from the crew. "We're going to Paris tomorrow." There had been no word from Dodie. No chance to prepare with ops or to coordinate with Fayed's flagship in Paris, the Ritz, which would do their on-the-ground planning. Trevor was now thoroughly annoyed as Dodie continued to withhold information. But they had told London of the possible move to Paris, so a contingency plan had been organised. And a trip to Paris was a nice way to finish, the 2 mates agreed. The Fayed Gulfstream arrived in Paris without fanfare, but the paparazzi were waiting. Their giant lenses recorded every movement of the party as they exited. Trevor led his charges down the stairs and felt confident that, for this one last overnight stay, they could manage. The princess and Dodie were happy to be in Paris, were not at all anxious, he felt. But here they faced a new and frightening dimension to the chase. In London, the paparazzi hunt by car, but in Paris they choose motorcycles and scooters as well, and the tensions between the princess and her pursuers that had built up, like the heat over the summer, were ready to boil over. Ordered by the Ritz, 2 vehicles, a Mercedes and a Range Rover, waited with their drivers. One was Philippe Dorneau, Dodie's regular driver in Paris and a licensed chauffeur of Étoile Limousine. The other, Henri Paul, was the assistant head of security for the Ritz. Dodie walked directly up to him, shook hands, and chatted. Trevor had met him before, but he didn't click with me as a person. He was perhaps a little too chatty, but Dodie had lots of faith in the man. They loaded up the two vehicles with Trevor, Philippe, Dodie, and the Princess leading in the Mercedes, and took off into a scene that made the chases in London seem tame. They were surrounded by screaming motorcycles which darted around the target vehicles, sometimes two to a bike so that the photographer could wield his camera. Trevor heard the Princess express her concern, not about the harassment, but that one of them might fall under the wheels and be killed. Dodie gave Philippe orders to put his foot down and lose them, and Philippe succeeded. Having briefly shed their pursuers, they raced off to the Villa Windsor, former home of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, and now leased by Mohammed Al-Fayed. The bodyguard spent the night there when in Paris. Dodie told Trevor to phone Kez and tell him to join them there after dropping Debbie, Myra, Renee, and the baggage at his apartment. Kez and Henri Paul were greeted by Ben Morel, one of Fayed's British security men. Morel noted that Henri Paul smelled as if he'd had a very good lunch, but if he did smell of wine, it was disguised for Kez, a non-smoker, by the offensive smell of Henri Paul's cigars. The restlessness that had begun during the last few days on the Jonicle became almost manic over the next few hours. From the Villa Windsor, the couple moved on to the Ritz, where Diana, with the hotel's security personnel covering for the bodyguards, had her hair done, while Dodie drove with Trevor the few hundred feet to the Reposy jewellery store. Kez and the acting hotel manager, Claude Roulet, followed on foot and waited outside the store with Trevor as Dodie went inside. He was apparently completing arrangements for The Ring to be delivered to the Ritz. As Kez walked back to the Ritz, he was studying the paparazzi. There were several scooters, several motorcycles. Trevor got a call saying the couple would be going to the Rue Arsène-Housset, just off the Champs-Élysées, to dress for dinner. Trevor put the couple in the lead Mercedes, with Philippe at the wheel, with Kez and himself following in the Range Rover. We could see the situation was winding them up, and we thought we'd just give them a bit of privacy, says Trevor. They were followed by journalists, but Trevor saw his technique of reasoning with them paying off. We'd asked them not to take any photos during the journey, especially at junctions and traffic lights. They did what we asked. The calm was broken as they arrived, and the paparazzi, who'd been waiting outside Dodie's apartment, surrounded the entrance door as the Mercedes nosed into the street. Gerard, a security man at the apartments, confronted a photographer and pushed him. The fragile truce between bodyguards and paparazzi threatened to disintegrate. The Princess was shaken, Dodie angry. As soon as the couple got upstairs, Trevor and Kez came down to try to calm the photographers. We know you've got to do your job, Kez said. Look, get your shots as they come and go without hassling them, and hold off from any pictures while they're in transit. Trevor shook hands with several of them, hoping he'd defuse the situation, and he bought a little privacy for the couple. Where are they going? Trevor asked Renee while Dodie and the Princess were dressing, desperately trying to find out what their evening plans were. Renee, if he knew, never shared it with the bodyguards. It was the Ritz's Claude Roulet who had made reservations for 9:45 at the fashionable Chez Benoit restaurant near the Pompidou Centre. They were 40 minutes late coming down, and on edge when they saw the number of paparazzi. But Trevor trusted the deal he'd struck and again put the couple up front with Philippe and followed with Kez in the Range Rover. The photographers raced along in escort, but honoured the deal, giving the couple a few minutes of privacy. Inside the Mercedes, a decision had been made to abort the plan to eat at Chez Benoit. It would be too public, and Trevor got a call that they were heading for the Ritz. Christ, no preparation. The paparazzi and tourists, by the time they'd left the Ritz last time, looked like a street fair, cameras everywhere, with a crowd of several hundred jostling at the entrance. As the excitement over where the couple would spend the night heightened, it would only get more intense. It was 9:50 as the two-car convoy pulled up close to the front entrance of the Ritz. Trevor raced to the car's rear door and opened it, ready to block for the couple as they rushed through the revolving doors and inside. Dodie paused. The couple didn't move. For Trevor, this was the limit. What was Dodie bloody doing? Trevor swiftly closed the car door again as the paparazzi zoomed in. The delay was no more than a few seconds, but by the time Dodie moved, cameras were all over the car. The couple were engulfed. Dodie's hand went up to shield his face. The princess looked anguished as she took a running stride towards the door. The results of Dodie's hesitation had enormously bothered the couple. In the mayhem, one photographer slipped through the revolving door. Trevor got rid of him straight away, but Dodie turned on Kes and gave him the mother of all bollockings. "How the fuck did this fiasco happen? Why didn't you have the reception arranged?" "You never told us where you were going. If you had, we'd have been able to phone ahead and get it sorted out," snapped Kes. They got the couple settled into the restaurant and returned to the front of the hotel. Trevor got the journalists pushed back to the other side of the service road leading to the Ritz and got the police to cordon them off far enough away so at least there couldn't be any physical assaults. At last, a chance to get a sandwich in the bar. They'd barely ordered their fizzy waters when they saw the couple walking through the foyer. The princess was crying, Kes noted. At 10:01, they hustled the pair upstairs to the door of the Imperial Suite. "We'll be eating in, so get yourselves some food," Dodie told them as he closed the door. Back at the bar, they saw a table near the entrance where they'd had a view of the staircase. At last, a club sandwich. Henri Paul came through the doors of the Ritz just a few seconds before 10:08, a jovial smile on his face and his ubiquitous cigar between the fingers of his left hand. Although he was off duty, he had been phoning in frequently for reports on the couple's movements and had received a call just before 10 o'clock from the Ritz's night security manager, François Tondil, telling him that the couple were going to eat in their suite. On his own initiative, Paul had returned to the hotel. He joined Trevor and Kes, who assumed he was on duty as they briefed him on the couple's status. Kes chatted with him a bit as Trevor ate his sandwich in silence. Kes had the distinct impression that Trevor didn't like Henri Paul. "I'd just met him that day, didn't even know he was the second in command of Ritz security. I thought he was just a chauffeur." Kes was disgusted again by the smell of cigars Paul was puffing. As Paul ordered a yellow drink, juice Kes assumed, Paul made a joke about it being ananas, pineapple, and the two had a crude little laugh over the arse part of the word. "Like a soldier's joke. I know it's pathetic, but we were giggling away," says Kes. It was turning to nervous laughter. Things were getting a bit tense because Trevor wouldn't speak to him, and then Henri Paul was telling us that we shouldn't be eating here because Mr. Klein, the hotel boss, wouldn't like it. "Well, I couldn't give a toss because we work for Mr. Fayed, nobody else," Kes snapped back. As he heard Henri Paul get adamant that Mr. Klein was his boss, Trevor put the issue firmly to rest. "Klein works for the boss, and so do you." "We gobbled our sandwiches and left," says Kes. The time spent with Henri Paul in the bar had been very brief. Only 5 minutes, as Kes recalls. There was nothing in his behaviour that raised a red flag. By the time Henri Paul left the bar, the barman had served the hotel's assistant head of security his second Ricard Pastis, a high-alcohol licorice-flavoured aperitif popular in France. Those two drinks would soon be revealed as the top-up to other drinking during the time between Paul's arrival home from the afternoon's airport pickup and his return to the hotel. As he finished his pastis, Paul's bloodstream carried a concentration of pure alcohol far superior to the legal level, as an autopsy would state, combined with a cocktail of 2 prescription drugs, an antidepressant and a deterrent to alcohol dependence, and low enough levels of the protein transferrin to indicate chronic alcoholism over the course of at least a week. As Trevor searched his memory later for details of this brief scene in the bar, he knew that it never crossed his mind that the drink might be alcoholic. Paul was speaking in English and not slurring his words. "It was clear to me that Henri Paul felt he was on duty," Trevor recalled. With the princess and the boss's son in the hotel, why else would he be there? Drinking on the job was such a deep taboo for Trevor that it would never occur to him, especially with such a senior and apparently trusted man. At 11:07, both bodyguards arrived upstairs and sat outside the Imperial Suite waiting for the word. The 2 cars were out front, with Jean-François Mouzat, a director of Étoile Limousine, and Philippe Dorneau awaiting orders. Trevor and Kez did not know that while they had been eating, Dodie had made a phone call to the hotel's night manager, Thierry Rocher, to report the paparazzi mess at the door. Hearing that Henri Paul had returned, Dodie asked Rocher to tell Paul that they would need a third car for him and the princess at the back of the hotel. The 2 cars they had used that day would stay at the front as a diversion. As Trevor and Kez waited outside the suite, Henri Paul came by several times and seemed very busy chatting with the hotel staff. Photographers report that he was agitated and sociable to an unusual degree as he moved around the entrances. 20 minutes before midnight, Henri Paul turned up at the door of the suite and told them, "The plan's been changed. We'll be leaving from the back of the hotel with just 1 car. He wants me to drive. The 2 other cars will leave from the front to divert the paparazzi. Dodie doesn't want a bodyguard." They'd be leaving in half an hour. This was a terrible plan. Henri Paul was a security man, not a chauffeur. They needed a 2-car convoy and a bodyguard. Trevor shot back to Henri Paul. "No fucking chance is he leaving without a bodyguard. No way in a million years it's going to be without me." The bodyguards announced that they'd have to report this to London, but Henri Paul confirmed, "It's been okayed by Mr. Mohammed." Kez is sure of this, the phrase, Mr. Mohammed. He had heard the second-in-command of security at the Ritz say this plan had been okayed by Fayed, but the plan was still a hopeless one. "It wasn't Henri Paul driving that bothered me," says Trevor. He'd already driven that day. It would have been like challenging Paul Hanley Greaves about driving the boss. It was the plan itself that disturbed. Minutes later, Dodie confirmed it all. Trevor was forceful. The photographers and the crowd had been moved back across the road. It would be quite safe to leave from the front, but Dodie insisted the party should leave from the back, with 1 car only. Still in stage whispers, Trevor was saying very forcefully, "There's absolutely no way you're going without security." This was non-negotiable. "Okay, one of you can come in the car in the front," Dodie finally relented. "We need a backup car as well. I'll bring one of the cars around from the front to the back," says Kez, pushing it. But Dodie was resolved. No, then people will know. Wave the cars forward so everyone will think we're coming out the front while we go out the back," he said, and vanished into the suite. Trevor went downstairs to find Henri Paul. The extra car was to be ordered by the Ritz, while Trevor was organising the chauffeurs. He called Philippe and Musa and briefed them and asked them to find Henri Paul, fast. It was 6 minutes after midnight. Alone with Dodie and Diana, Kez gave it one last try. "But 2 cars is best." Then Dodie evoked the magic words. "It's been okayed by my father." Was he telling the truth or not? Fayed would later admit to talking to Dodie 15 minutes before he left the Ritz, but stated that, with regard to the decision to ask Henri Paul to drive, he knew absolutely nothing about it. Rather, he said, he had cautioned Dodie to be careful and to spend the night in the hotel if necessary. Kez was in a no-win situation. Ringing Fayed at midnight, doubting his son's word, wasn't a way to stay employed. You can respectfully suggest that a plan is crap, but if they don't listen, your hands are tied. Almost immediately after Trevor's direction to the drivers about Henri Paul, Roulet turned up and asked Musa to put another car at Dodie's disposal. According to Philippe, he reiterated that the car was to be driven by Henri Paul and that the couple would come out by the back entrance. Trevor did not know that Henri Paul was not licensed to drive the commercial limousine which Musa ordered. Musa claimed that he offered to drive, but they were working in a situation of urgency. No one had time to think. Between the moment Trevor asked the chauffeurs to come and the car starting its engine, fewer than 10 minutes had elapsed, and the Ritz was virtually Etoile's only client. How could Musa refuse Roulet's order? The car would be a Mercedes S280, bought by Etoile second-hand in 1994. It had no darkened windows or bulletproof armour. Etoile also owned the armour-plated Mercedes Fayed always used, but they had not been asked to send it to the airport earlier or to use it for Dodie's royal guest. Dodie had never used the heavy as long as I'd been with him, says Trevor. Shortly after midnight, a Ritz car jockey, Frédéric Lucard, received word to bring up the car from the underground garage and round to the rear entrance of the Ritz. As Dodie and the princess left the imperial suite, she seemed happy, Kez observed. Well, they both were. It was obvious they'd had a glass of wine or two. Chatting with the couple, Kez said, "It's just a 10-minute drive. I'll see you back at the apartment." Then he slipped in lightly, "So it's straight back then, not to a nightclub?" "No, straight back," said Diana, laughing. Dodie's plan had backfired even before they reached the rear door on the Rue Cambon. A handful of paparazzi had figured out that a ruse was in play and lay in wait. By 12:19, the four stood in the narrow service corridor, Dodie and the princess facing a staff bulletin board as a smiling Henri Paul chatted to them, animatedly using both hands to make his points. Trevor checked outside. Where was the Mercedes? Still en route. Dodie and the princess huddled side by side, waiting, with Dodie's left arm around her waist as Paul chatted on. Trevor remembers they seemed very relaxed. As Trevor looked out at the back entrance, just down the road was a small white hatchback type of car and perhaps a scooter or a motorbike, I believe, with 2 or 3 journalists. He was relieved there weren't more, but knew it was a hollow victory. They would soon be on their phones to their colleagues at the front. The pack would be upon them within seconds. As the Mercedes arrived, Henri Paul pushed open the metal grille door and stepped towards the car to make the switch of drivers. Observers and videotape reveal no hesitancy on his part. Carrying enough alcohol in his bloodstream to make him more than twice over the drink driving limit, Henri Paul slipped into the driver's seat. Had Trevor seen any sign of impairment, he would have stopped him. He would put up with orders just so far, but Trevor would never have knowingly let a drunk man drive. He preceded the princess out at the door, followed by Dodie about 10 feet behind. Flashbulbs popped as Trevor briskly ushered the princess into the back seat. Kez took Trevor's call on the hotel's internal phone just inside the front door of the Ritz. "We're about to move now." Kez went to the front and flashed the sign to the 2 drivers for all the paparazzi and tourists to see, meaning bring the cars forward so that all attention would focus on them. In the Rue Cambon, the paparazzi were shooting photos as the Mercedes doors closed and Paul pushed the gear into drive. Seconds before 12:20 a.m., the Mercedes left at speed. Trevor's clearest and last memories of the night are of the Mercedes pulling away. He again saw the white or light-coloured car that crossed the road and followed us. I do not remember if the motorbikes followed us, but I do know that journalists were following us. My last memory is of moving off. I do not remember anything more. Henri Paul manoeuvred the car along the fastest route back to the apartment on an August Saturday night, bypassing the late movie crowd on the Champs-Élysées for a diversion to the left along the Seine. The primary delays would be traffic lights. As they reached the first set at the end of the block, they'd already acquired an aggressive escort of motorcycles, with more converging. They moved swiftly through the next corner, but were halted as the traffic from Rue Saint-Florentin crossed in front of them, merging into the frenzied wheel of traffic that circled the Place de la Concorde. The Mercedes was stopped by the first of several traffic lights along that northern flank of the Place de la Concorde, an alarming chance for the paparazzi to catch up. A witness, Monsieur Bonin, also heading for a right turn at the quay, found himself next to a very big black Mercedes off to my left. Then he noted a big black motorcycle with 2 people on it. The person on the back was carrying a camera and was literally taking pictures continuously with a flashlight into this car. Paparazzi, he thought. Then I recognized Dodi Fayed. On his right sat Princess Diana. Behind the wheel was a man of 45 years of age. He wore glasses, and a blonde young man next to him I assumed was the bodyguard. The bodyguard seemed irritated, turning his head very often. Bonin also observed that Dodi and the princess did not have their seatbelts on. He couldn't tell about the 2 in the front seat. As the light turned green, Bonin drove straight ahead and noticed that there seemed to be a black car in front of the Mercedes which did not start, blocking the princess's car. Then I saw in my mirror that the Mercedes had swerved over to the right and the engine made a lot of noise. As Bonin approached his right turn onto the quay, he says, I saw a Mercedes pass very quickly by the right-hand side. He lost sight of the Mercedes as it sped along the straight, unobstructive expressway along the Seine. This is where Henri Paul could and did pick up speed to try to outrun the motorcycles. It is where, given Dodi's pattern of frustration with the paparazzi, he could have urged Paul to accelerate and get away. The Mercedes entered a long tunnel under 2 bridges, the Pont Alexandre III and the Pont des Invalides, emerging onto a leafy stretch with trees overhanging the quay on both sides. They were less than 10 seconds from the crash. It is here, immediately on exiting the first tunnel, and just before entering the descending curve to the left, which leads into the tunnel under the Place de l'Alma, that Henri Paul had almost certainly planned to exit the expressway to the right. The last exit before the tunnel, it would have given him a straight shot up to the Avenue Georges V to Dodie's apartment just 3 minutes away. Controversy will always shroud this moment. Trevor's best record of events has to be the findings of the French criminal investigation's rigorous 14-month technical examination and reconstruction of all the evidence. One of its conclusions, that Henri Paul may have been forced into the Alma tunnel because motorcycles blocked the exit he intended to take, is a leap of faith unsupported by hard proof. But the facts that lead to that conclusion are as accurate a reconstruction of events as history will ever have. The Mercedes, as it approached the tunnel, was travelling at a speed between 73 and 96 miles per hour, in a speed zone limited to 30 miles per hour. 5 paparazzi motorbikes were in pursuit. What was the bodyguard doing as Henri Paul pressed the accelerator? All he knows is that he'd have felt the usual frustration, stripped of the professional control he needed to do his job properly. But if Henri Paul was going so outrageously fast that it was going to cause an accident, I think I would have made a comment. He would not have grabbed the wheel or put his foot on the brake. That would have compounded the danger. Discreetly, I'd have said, "Slow down, we're going too fast." Dodie might not have agreed. If Paul had heard 2 competing orders, who was he going to obey? Anyone who has driven through that or any other Paris tunnel knows that speed in excess of the legal limits are routine. But just as Henri Paul was simultaneously faced with navigating the left curve and substantial dip which lead into the tunnel, he was confronted by a small white Fiat Uno blocking the right lane. The small car, after a heroic nationwide hunt in which 3,000 owners of Fiat Unos were questioned, has never been found. But paint chips, dents, glass, marks on the Mercedes and its damaged rear-view mirror prove without question that Henri Paul had a minor collision with a Fiat Uno as he raced by. It is here that Trevor's reactions may well have come into play. Here that he might have grabbed for his seatbelt and pulled it part of the way across his chest. But if he did, events were moving too fast and too violently for him to complete the buckling. With contact with the Fiat Uno, the crash sequence had begun. The condition of the car itself was not a contributing factor. Exhaustive tests proved that the Mercedes was in perfect working order, but other factors now compounded each other. First, Henri Paul's exit may have been blocked by 1 or 2 of the pursuing motorcycles, giving him no choice but the tunnel. Second, with speed too high to navigate the smallest curve, the car became difficult to control. Third, the contact with the Fiat Uno. 3 dangerous, virtually simultaneous events, each to be interpreted and resolved in split seconds. Henri Paul was drunk and confronted by more danger than he could sort out. The immutable laws of physics take hold. Just as the Mercedes reaches the curve to the left, it is pulled irresistibly to the right by centrifugal force, and Paul faces a Fiat Uno in his path. As he pulls to the left to avoid it, he swipes the Fiat's left rear end, a minor collision, but forceful enough to send the front of the smaller car to the left as the rear is pushed to the right, shrinking the Mercedes' driving space. Paul is now racing down a narrow canyon, a row of concrete pillars to his left, the Fiat so close on the right that for a split second the 2 vehicles tear along in tandem, the Mercedes' right-wing mirror shattering against the Fiat's side as he tries to swerve around the car. He skids to the left for 19 meters, 1 wheel off the ground, and just as he passes the Fiat and turns to the right to get ahead of his nemesis, his path is blocked by yet another car ahead of the Fiat, a Citroën BX. He turns the wheel left, too hard, and skids inexorably towards the pillars dividing the tunnel in 2. Tall, square, white, and unforgiving. The pillars have, for 30 years, been an invitation to tragedy. This tunnel has already taken 8 lives and left another 8 people severely injured in 34 accidents. Still fighting for control, Henri Paul instinctively reaches for the gears to shift down from 4th to 3rd to slow the breakneck speed. But errors in judgment are now cascading upon him. He has forgotten, perhaps, that he is driving an automatic car, and throws the gear into neutral, freewheeling instead of slowing. He finally hits the brakes just 64 meters before impact. Too late. the Mercedes has become a hurtling death capsule, still estimated to be travelling at over 60 miles per hour. At 12:23 a.m., just 3 minutes after leaving the Ritz, the Mercedes ploughs head-on into the 13th pillar, the right-angled edge of the pillar crumpling the bonnet like a handful of cellophane in a giant's hand. On impact, both front airbags deploy in less than 20 milliseconds. On the driver's side, the airbag holds Paul back momentarily, but cannot stop the steering wheel, engine and radiator from being thrust back against his body, killing him instantly. Trevor's airbag saves his life as the entire front of the car concertinas into a chaotic tangle of twisted metal, protecting him from instant death. The impact has left him almost unscathed. But now, as the Mercedes rebounds from impact, it rotates clockwise at high speed and crashes against the tunnel wall to the right. At the first shock of deceleration, Dodie and the Princess were propelled violently forward, smashing into the front seats, but now the whirling car compounds their bodies' stubborn momentum, hurling them at high speeds against the car's interior. The impact and extreme deceleration leave Diana's heart displaced from the left to the right side of its cavity. The injuries were so serious, the severing of the vital pulmonary vein and rupturing of the pericardium, the heart's protective sac, that the judge's medical experts would ultimately report, there is no example in international medical history where a person suffering from such an injury survived. And then they come to rest. The Mercedes was now facing back towards the entrance of the tunnel. Dodie's crushed ribs had punctured the lung and blood vessels, creating internal bleeding that, with a ruptured aorta and spinal fracture at the neck, would be named the cause of his death. The Princess was slumped on the floor, leaning against the back of Trevor's seat. Her legs were twisted, one under her, the other on the seat. Blood came from a cut on the forehead and trickled from nose and mouth, but her face was almost intact. With her chin down on her chest and her eyes closed, she looked beautiful, serene, asleep. The internal trauma could not be seen. Trevor had survived the first impact with little damage, but he lost the protection of the airbag as the car spun right and hit the wall, and his body kept flying forward, smashing the left side of his face and chest against the dashboard and windshield. The sight of the bloody gashes and loose flaps of flesh horrified early witnesses as Trevor slumped semi-conscious, his face flat against the dash. The lower half of his face was ripped off and hanging loose, was one of the graphic descriptions that shaped the global image of Trevor's condition. Another, his mouth and tongue were ripped off, launched the rumour that swiftly spread that Trevor's tongue had been severed. It had not. The paparazzi had skidded their motorbikes to a halt and run with their cameras to the scene. A photographer named Romuald Rott was the first. He instantly snapped 3 photos. Rott claimed that he then opened the right rear door to try to help the Princess and told her in English to stay cool, hold on, help would come. He claims to have heard someone shout, "I have called the emergency services." Then he and the others went aggressively about their business, shooting a total of 118 pictures, which were taken from as close as 1 meter from Diana's head and as far as 10 meters. The first police to arrive instantly determined that the Princess seemed to be in better shape than the Bodyguard, and that the 2 on the left were dead. Picking up a radio call at 12:30 and racing to the scene, arriving before the rescue teams, policemen Lino Gagliardone and Sebastian Dorze had to struggle to get through the photographers. Even though they said, the Princess was bleeding from her mouth and nose and had a profound wound on the forehead, she was very much alive. She was mumbling something in English as Dorze spoke to her, trying to keep her from slipping into unconsciousness. Gagliardone tried to hold back the photographers, who were using their cameras as if they were machine guns. A photographer said to him in a very vulgar manner, "Leave me alone, let me do my job. In Sarajevo, the policemen usually let us work. You just have to have people shoot at you and you will see." Then, with the arrival of the rescue teams, the police could control the paparazzi, set up cordons, and extend the secure perimeter of the crash site. Trevor's care had begun with the arrival of the first 2 teams of firemen at 12:32. In command, Sergeant Xavier Gourmelon. Standing near the woman, Gourmelon heard the words in English, "My God, what's happened?" and saw her move her left arm and legs as he issued his orders. The camion de désincarcération, the can opener, and spotlight van arrives under the command of Arnaud Forge, who wedges the car in place and starts removing the roof, cutting first across the back, then through Trevor's seat and through the door. Trevor's seatbelt is stretched out and stuck, and must be cut before Trevor's limp form can be eased out. A police photo reveals a shocking fact. Trevor's face has been flattened, his nose and eye sockets pushed back so far that in profile his nose scarcely protrudes beyond his lips. Although the earliest hands-on work on the victims was being done by the fireman, all medical action was supervised from his arrival by Dr. Arnaud de Rossi, the designated rescue physician for the accident. De Rossi, in his swift survey of the 4 passengers, saw, like others, Diana's shape as severe but not critical. The words he heard her say were confused, but she was speaking. As she was finally freed from the wreckage at 1 a.m., de Rossi saw her go into cardiac arrest. The extreme fragility of her condition was becoming clear. "I had to intubate her, give her respiratory ventilation and a heart massage to revive her," he reported, before she could be placed in the ambulance. As, at last, Diana could be given a medical evaluation, the police report would describe her condition as falling into coma, multiple fractures of right arm, bleeding wound on the head and right back, and chest trauma, very severe state. Diana was trapped in the wreck for nearly 40 minutes while her lifeblood flowed out from the torn vein, and many physicians concur with the French report that no other surgical, anesthetic, or resuscitation strategy could have prevented deterioration in the condition of the patient. Shortly after 1 in the morning, Mohammed Al-Fayed learned of the crash and of his son's death. At 1:45, British Ambassador Sir Michael Jay was notified while Diana's ambulance was still en route to the hospital. He would call the royal family, with Prince Charles first to be informed that the princess had been seriously injured. At 1:30 a.m., the ambulance carrying the princess moved slowly towards La Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital across the Seine. Diana's heart was now so frail that twice the doctor ordered the ambulance to stop so that she could be stabilized. The bodies of Dodi and Henri Paul were transported to the morgue next door to the hospital. Paul underwent an autopsy. Dodi did not, as his body would be returned to England that day for immediate burial, as Islamic custom requires. A male nurse, Dominique Hanier, had been the first to give intensive care to the princess after she arrived at the reanimation unit. "I am positive the princess was totally unconscious when she arrived, and she never became conscious again." 2 leading surgeons were on duty as the princess arrived. Cardiovascular surgeon Dr. Alain Parvy and anaesthetist Dr. Bruno Rieu were scrubbing for surgery when they were told who their patient would be. The surgeon opened her chest to get into the lungs and find the source of the bleeding, Hanier reported. The thoracic cavity was awash. The discovery that it was a pulmonary vein, the major line between lungs and heart, was devastating. The drainage of blood for more than an hour and a half ensured that irreversible damage had been done to organs and had almost certainly damaged the brain. "We immediately tried to evacuate this bleeding with a pulmonary drain so that the lungs were not compressed too much," says Hanier. "We transfused her with massive amounts of blood, but it was not enough. Diana's heart kept stopping. To keep her alive, the nurses injected enormous amounts of adrenaline, 150 injections of 5 milligrams each, direct into her heart. In a desperate, last-ditch effort to save her, doctors massaged the heart by hand for many minutes, but at 4 a.m. the doctors admitted defeat and declared her dead." One of the finest facial surgeons in Paris, Dr. Luc Chicani, is in bed at home when he receives the call from the junior doctor in intensive care. He is told that Diana's bodyguard has just arrived and needs maximum care. Chicani runs a gauntlet of armed men as he makes his way to the emergency operating room. They are Secret Service from England, France, and Egypt, he is told. As he enters the emergency operating room, he shuts off the clamoring world outside the door. The patient, this bodyguard whose name he does not know, is unconscious. but their relationship has begun. What he sees is a fracas, a crashed face. It is one of the most crushed and shattered faces he has ever seen. Even the intensive care doctors who've seen everything are coming by to look at this extraordinary case. Strangely, the skin, except for the 2 big cuts, is roughly preserved. As Chikani touches the skin, everything is moving all over the place, and there is a sort of grinding sound. Underneath the skin, he knows it is mush. He orders X-rays, a CT scan. The scan shows extensive bleeding around the skull, oedema, but there is no skull fracture or gross damage to the brain. The first good news in terms of Trevor surviving at all. But the scan reveals a broken left wrist, internal injury to the chest, and so many broken and displaced bones that it will require massive surgery to try to piece a face together again. Fractures, though, are the secondary emergency. The first is to make Trevor breathe, to keep him alive. First, Chikani must do a tracheotomy, then pay attention to internal bleeding and lesions, bladder, liver, kidney, heart. No reconstruction can be done until the swelling and bleeding of the head are reduced, if he survives this day. Before sunrise on Sunday the 31st of August, 2 surgeons descend on the shattered body. Chikani knows that creating a relationship with Trevor is vital to his survival. He may be unconscious, but he's not absent. Chikani touches Trevor and tells him, "You will not die. You will not die." If this patient is to survive and become himself again, he must have extraordinary will. He must do his own healing. As Kez left his post in Paris and drove to Le Bourget airport, Claude Roulet drove with him. They pulled the cars up close to the helipad. It was 4:55. The aircraft was just about to touch down when Roulet took a call and passed it to Kez. "It's the British consulate for you. The princess is dead." That was it then. "Right, cheers," was all Kez could muster, as he looked up to see Mr. Fayed and the 2 bodyguards stepping out of the helicopter. He'd never touched the boss before, but now he put his arm on his shoulder and said, "Look, sir, I'm sorry for your loss." Fayed mumbled something disconsolate. "I'm sorry, sir, I've got some more bad news for you." "The princess?" "Dead." 5 of them drove into Paris to retrieve Dodi's body, Kez in the front, Fayed in the back. "I hope the British government is satisfied now," Fayed suddenly erupted. "Nobody could have wished this, sir," said Kez, shocked. Then the boss just sort of slumped back in his seat. The terrible announcement of the deaths had just been made at the hospital as Fayed and Kez arrived at the front steps. This plain, unadorned entrance had become the center of the world. Fayed was met on the steps by a hospital official. Though Fayed would soon claim that inside a nurse had delivered to him Diana's last words, "I would like all my possessions in Dodi's apartment to be given to my sister Sarah, including my jewelry and my personal clothes, and please tell her to take care of my boys," a claim decisively repudiated by the hospital, Kez always knew it had not happened. Fayed never went into the hospital, not even the foyer. They were only there 10 minutes. Kez was beside Fayed on the steps the whole time. They went on to the morgue to claim Dodi's body. They picked up luggage at the apartment where Debbie had packed the princess's clothes, and by the time they were driving back to the airport, Fayed was in command again, detailing his people off to do this, do that, hunting for people to blame. End of Side 2. Side 3. London responded to its disbelief and grief over the tragic death of Princess Diana with flowers, acres, tons of flowers. The first bouquets laid at the gates at Kensington Palace before dawn were fast becoming a flood, with notes, photos, and mementos that would swell night and day and fan out across the lawn into a fragrant floral lake. Throughout the world, churches and embassies became spontaneous shrines. How could it end in a car crash? Who was to blame? By sunrise, the hunt for culprits had found its target. Millions had seen the television images of a forlorn group of photographers hauled off to jail from the crash site. Eyewitnesses were describing their callous behavior, offering no help, descending on the crash like vultures, flashbulbs firing like machine guns, obstructing emergency care. Within 2 days, 9 would be named as suspects in the French criminal investigation. Another cause had been named within minutes of the crash, out of view of the tabloids and networks. Assassination. Conspiracy. At 6:40:59, 2.5 hours after Diana's declared death, the first Diana website went up, and 13 minutes later, the first conspiracy website. Conspiracy theories would eventually rage worldwide on 36,000 websites, charging MI6, the CIA, and others as agents of death for the British government, the royal family, and even for arms dealers who had feared Diana's anti-landmine campaign. The Egyptian press instantly seized on the conspiracy theory, recruiting even its most distinguished writers and journals of record to charge assassination as a British tactic to prevent a royal marriage between the Muslim son of a famous Egyptian and the mother of future kings. Fayed's own conspiracy theory was born at news of the crash. Rumours were already spreading among Fayed drivers and security men in Paris that Henri Paul had been drinking. Could the conspiracy theory be a response? At 4:30 p.m., Ritz boss Frank Klein went to the Paris Judiciary Police to report suspicious circumstances surrounding the crash, and John McNamara, Fayed's senior security chief, was assigned to a full-time worldwide investigation. Next day, 1st of September, another essential building block of the conspiracy theory, the engagement and imminent marriage of Dodi and Diana, would be put into place as Michael Cole gave reporters the breathless headline, "Dodi aimed to spend rest of life with Di." All these threads would lead to Trevor's door. Jill knew her son by his ears, battered by rugby. Through the blood and bandages, she could see a face that looked as though it had been hit with a frying pan, like a Tom and Jerry cartoon. It had been smashed back, widened and flattened. The whole contours of his face were just demolished. The injuries were appalling. He was unrecognizable. The life support equipment spoke eloquently of his fragility. Tubes up his nose, an arterial line, a drip in his right arm, a lung drain that came out between his ribs, a ventilator breathing for him through the tracheal tube stuck into his windpipe, a cervical collar to immobilize the cracked vertebrae in his neck. They had been with Trevor for less than 10 minutes when an official came up and said, "Prince Charles wants to meet you when he arrives. Would you come with me, please?" Reluctantly, Jill, Ernie, and Sue followed him down the lobby. The surreal drama swirled around them. Security, police, hospital personnel everywhere. An honor guard of the Garde Républicaine flanked the entrance. As they were about to be ushered into their audience with the Prince of Wales, a nurse rushed up. "Your son. He has awakened." "We left the official group, stood up His Royal Highness as we belted back to the ward," says Ernie, their words of regret and thanks to Prince Charles echoing behind them as they rushed to Trevor's bedside. Jubilant that an eye had opened, they held his hands and talked to him. "We're not sure he could focus on us, but without a shadow of a doubt, he knew we were there," says Jill. They were permitted just 5 more minutes with him. They rushed downstairs again, but Prince Charles had departed with Diana's coffin. On the hospital steps, Jill and Sue were given a hug by British Consul General Keith Moss with tears in his eyes, and moved quickly into a waiting limo. It pulled up to the doors of Fayed's apartments, where Trevor had been just 24 hours earlier. Gerard, the security guard, took them up to a scene of luxury we had only seen in stately homes. Jill, Ernie, and Sue walked around, gasping at the lavishness. A lounge big enough to hold a dance, a dining room with massive marble fireplace, wonderful carpets, silk tapestry wall coverings. And food, Madame the caretaker explained to Jill in French. Anything they wished could be ordered from the Ritz. They'd not eaten since the day before. "Well, perhaps un peu à manger," Jill responded in halting French. Shortly, food arrived in elegant cream and gold boxes, enough for 8 or 9 people. Smoked salmon, cold beef, pâté, fresh rolls, salad, wine, and a display of fruit that looked like a 17th century still life painting. They went to bed amid the grandeur, but were sleepless. Disbelieving, profoundly grateful to Mohammed El-Fayed for looking after them, he even gave them a chauffeur, Philippe Dorneau. Along with the whole of Oswestry that Sunday, lawyer Ian Lucas was watching television, woken by his 6-year-old daughter who had come shrieking into her parents' bedroom. "Mum, Dad, the Princess of Wales has been killed." A secretary at the Crawford Lucas law firm, Tessa Lloyd, called her boss at home. "I think you should know that we act for the bodyguard Trevor Rees-Jones." Ian had never met him, but his firm was handling his divorce. David Crawford knew nothing of the connection until he came into the office on Monday morning. But he had known Trevor's father, Colin Rees. Colin was a great bloke, a very strong personality. His heart attack had been a tragic loss. What must the family now be enduring? Crawford and Ian agreed that, with an event of this magnitude, the Rees-Joneses would need someone to advise them. They composed a letter to the hospital, saying, in effect, that they were the lawyers of Trevor Rees-Jones, available should the hospital wish to, in any way, communicate with them, and would they please send this letter on to him or his family. It went off by fax to the director of La Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital on Monday the 1st of September. In Paris that morning, in what would become the daily midday visit to Trevor, they gathered round his bed. Jill and Ernie each took a hand as Sue leaned over and talked to him. He responded totally to her. He knew her voice, Jill saw. A good sign, but she felt a flaring of concern. Would Trevor remember that they were separated when he woke up? What if he wants and needs her? Sue had absolutely no intention of coming back, Jill knew. She'd been perfectly honest about that. Sue went home that day at Jill's urging. Trevor was just too vulnerable. "We had to bring him back to the real world," Dr. Puybosson had advised us. Jill began speaking to him, trying to reach that flicker of consciousness he had shown. She told him the 4 things she would repeat, like a mantra, each time she visited. There's been an accident, you're in Paris, you're in a hospital, you're going to be all right. Back at the apartment, they met Ben Morrell, the security man based at the Villa Windsor. He was assigned to provide Jill and Ernie with anything they might need. The press were a hovering threat. Whenever they looked from the balcony, there were film crews everywhere. "We think we got wind of the fact that we were there and were in wait. We felt besieged," Ernie noted, dismayed. 9 photographers and a motorcycle rider had been named as targets of the French investigation. Wielding the French Good Samaritan law, which requires people to help unless they would endanger themselves doing so, the investigation would be for the crimes of involuntary homicide, failure to assist people in danger, and involuntary wounding of the survivor, Trevor. If charged and found guilty, they faced up to 5 years in prison and a massive fine. The world wanted to know about the bodyguard. The British Embassy was being flooded with requests for interviews with the Rees-Joneses, and asked Jill and Ernie to come in to discuss the handling of the media, as well as to introduce them to the ambassador. Things were becoming complex. Jill called David Crawford. Crawford could see nothing that required immediate legal attention, but as he and Jill chatted, Crawford referred to the remarkable news he had just heard on British radio. The driver of the car had had the equivalent of 3 times the legal limit of alcohol in his blood. A drunk driver. It threw the guilt of the paparazzi into confusion and pointed blame at an employee of the Ritz. Jill had not heard the news. David was astounded. "Are you being looked after by the Fayed family?" he asked. Yes, they were. Crawford saw that possible issues of conflict with Fayed and the Ritz might arise for Trevor. Trevor had been injured in the line of duty. He had interests and rights that must be protected, and it did not take an overly suspicious mind to see that Fayed might well have an interest in gaining early and exclusive access to Trevor's memories. But Trevor had to be kept heavily sedated until after his massive facial surgery, which was set for Thursday the 4th of September. That Wednesday, Jill and Ernie went to their appointment with the ambassador and his wife, Sir Michael and Lady J. Following a wonderful tea, they were given their first stack of press clippings. Jill and Ernie were astounded by the coverage of Trevor. The press had turned Trevor into a military hero, and Jill and Ernie knew he would be embarrassed to death, He'd never been in the Gulf or the Falklands, never served in the close protection team of the Royal Military Police, or escaped from Kuwait as the Iraqis invaded. The embassy wanted us to speak, but we refused, says Ernie. I think the embassy felt that our not speaking had to do with Mr. Fayed's instructions. It wasn't that at all. It was more that we were so emotional at that time that any one question could have triggered the response they were looking for, which would have been, Jill completes the sentence, a breakdown. So the embassy settled with the agreement that Jill and Ernie would write their own press releases, and the embassy would send them out. No interviews. The next morning, Dr. Luke Ciccani lifted his scalpel and made an incision across Trevor's face, from inside the mouth, just above the upper teeth, then another from jaw to jaw below the lower teeth, and began to peel back half of his face to the chin. This was the most exciting challenge of his career, the total reconstruction of Trevor's face. An array of Trevor's wedding pictures was taped to the walls, 2 meters away from Trevor's sedated body. Ciccani had one aim, 100% return not only of Trevor's face, but of its function, to have Trevor as he was before. If Jill's first sight of Trevor evoked the imagery of a Tom and Jerry cartoon, the surgery was more science fiction, an extraordinary process that would expose his entire face one half at a time. The aim was to make no visible scars. As Ciccani laid bare the mid-face, the mouth, chin, lower jaw, he faced a landscape of fractured, free-floating bones and masses of bone debris, of teeth cracked and skewed crazily from their orderly rows. It was mush. Ciccani secured wire at the outer ends of the cheekbones, then stretched it, top and bottom, across the upper and lower jaws, creating 2 wire arcs. Then he wired the jaw, wrapped wire around each tooth, attached it to the wire arcs, and fixed the 2 jaws together with many other wires, locking the mouth closed. The skin was rolled back over the mouth and clamped, but not yet sewn into place. Ciccani could not stop. The patient could not survive it. He paused for 20 minutes to eat, his only break, and then he turned his attention to the upper half of the face. The mid-face had been severely displaced. The distance between the 2 eyes had been expanded from roughly 1.5 to 2.5 inches, and the eye sockets had been depressed a full inch. A stack of titanium mini and micro plates with screws and washers sat at hand. Ciccani would position disconnected pieces of bone together, put plates on both sides, then screw the plates together, reconnecting the pieces. He would be rejoining the articular surfaces of the jaw joint to the skull, fusing cleaved cheek and chin bones, rebuilding the shattered bottom floor of the orbital cavity, the eye sockets and the whole orbital wall on both sides, and pulling the entire mid-face forward. As he explored, he found that Trevor's eyes were miraculously intact. For hours, he gently moved shattered pieces of bone around and drilled tiny holes and attached the plates, gently forcing the pieces of bone together where they would knit. If the lower face had been a monument to wire, this would be a monument to titanium plates. He would use 40 of them. He would also take some bone from the back of the skull and graft it to the cheekbones to create a bridge. Then, with flesh and cartilage grafts, he would fashion a new nose. At 6:30 p.m., after more than 11 hours of surgery, everything that could be fixed was fixed. Ciccani must call the parents. The surgery had been a success. Trevor was stable. Recovery would be total. Jill and Ernie were jubilant, drained. But on that Saturday, the 6th of September, they could not watch Diana's funeral. It was not bearable. When Jill and Ernie arrived on Monday the 8th of September, there was great excitement in the ward. The change, Ernie recorded, is dramatic. His eyes are open. He responds to Jill by moving a cheek muscle and an eye. We were absolutely over the moon, Jill says. Earlier that morning, Jill and Ernie had gone to the Ritz Hotel at the invitation of the hotel's president, Frank Klein, to meet a lawyer, Jean-Pierre Brisé. The purpose of that meeting, as Ernie saw it, was to express concern for Trevor and to suggest the names of suitable lawyers in Paris, in particular, Theo Klein of Klein Goddard. Trevor has Mr. David Crawford available to represent him, they told the hotel manager, as he handed the couple their second float of 2,250 francs. They took it with no sense of obligation to Mr. Fayed. Trevor, a valued employee, had been working when the accident had happened. As David Crawford would say, it was the least he could do. The Ring story broke on Tuesday the 9th of September and spread like a virulent cancer, backing Fayed's claims of an engagement. The day the Ring became part of legend, Trevor came off the ventilator, breathing for himself for the first time. He couldn't talk because his jaws were wired shut and the tube in his throat permitted no sound. But Jill and Ernie had written a small alphabet. If he opened an eye, they pointed to letters and tried to interpret his tiny reactions to form a word. Could he still think, reason, and remember? Back at the apartment, Paul Hanley Greaves and John McNamara, Fayed's two heads of security, were waiting for them. The two had been denied access to Trevor by the hospital staff and asked many questions about the crash. What they really wanted to know, Ernie could tell, was whether Trev had remembered anything. David Crawford arrived in Paris on the 9th of September. The trip had come up spontaneously, but he learned that the Rees-Joneses urgently wanted to meet him. Could he join them at their 3:45 appointment at the embassy that afternoon? Consul General Keith Moss introduced them to Dominic McCluskey, an attorney with the Paris law firm Klein Goddard, which was on the list of approved firms for Britons in need of help. He was the legal counsel to the ambassador. The theme of the meeting was quickly revealed. Trevor needed to get himself a French lawyer, and McCluskey was there to offer Klein Goddard's services, and specifically those of his senior partner, one Theo Klein. That name again. McCluskey explained the reasons Trevor might need a lawyer. In the investigation, Trevor could be three things: a victim, a witness, or an accused. Accused? No one ever had suggested Trevor might be held responsible. It filled us with horror because the thought had simply not crossed our minds, says Crawford. They had avoided the papers and not seen the independent experts' criticism of the Bodyguard security practices. There was the seatbelt. The fireman who had helped Trevor, seeing the seatbelt pulled out and trapped against his body, had assumed Trevor had been wearing it at the time of the crash. In that single inadvertent misreading of evidence, the myth of Trevor's seatbelt was born, bringing him accolades as a model of seatbelt safety on one hand, but also vicious attacks ranging from unprofessionalism to being part of an assassination conspiracy on the other. Why was Trevor the only one wearing a seatbelt, when the Bodyguard's rules require that you stay unbelted to protect your clients? The accusing question was soon asked. We were absolutely horrified. We needed help, and we needed it quickly, says Ernie. All were in agreement. Trevor must have his own French lawyer. Crawford would pursue it. The Paris prosecutor's office released the third report on Henri Paul's alcohol level. Third test confirms crash driver had drunk heavily, declared the Times. Fayed's lawyers maintained the attack on the photographers, but some evidence Fayed could not avoid. He had finally been forced to publicly concede Paul's alcohol levels, and he righteously condemned drink driving. Mohammed wants the truth, and if anyone is culpable, I will personally spit on his grave. But he did not relinquish his defense that no one knew Paul was drunk, that his staff were not culpable. Trevor could not speak. It was time to call on Kes. Kes took the call from Paul Hanley Greaves. We want you to do an interview for American TV. No way, thought Kes. He'd heard the news about Paul being drunk. Christ, he can't have been. He looked normal, was his shocked response. But every television show would be asking, didn't you know? Hanley Greaves rang back. Look, the boss says, can't you find it in your heart to do it? How could I refuse? Minutes before the ABC cameras started rolling, John McNamara said to me, think about what you say, which I took to mean that if I gave away any information that could be used against Fayed, my career would be finished. And then he sat in the room. We're going to meet a guy from the Mail on Sunday, said McNamara afterwards. And you're going on Panorama tonight? On the Panorama interview, Kes could hear himself saying on camera, Dodie's plan was a good one. It worked. I was still trying to spare Mr. Fayed's feelings. The Daily Mail headline the next morning, the 11th of September, was the Ritz's worst nightmare. Fayed's men face charges. It went on. Paris Ritz may be prosecuted over drug driver. Top executives may face manslaughter charges over the death of Princess Diana. We must tell Trevor today that he is the only survivor. Jill was resolved as they entered the hospital that morning. They dreaded what the shock might do to him. Jill started with her mantra. There's been a car accident. You're going to be all right. Then she took his good hand and told him gently, Trevor, you are the only survivor of the accident. Inside, Trevor had understood. He was able to absorb his mother's words and feel shock and disbelief, but he must confirm it. With his right hand, he pointed to the chart, spelled out Dodie. He is dead. Trevor pointed again, spelled out Diana. Yes, she's dead too. Henri Paul is dead. That was when the tears came, says Jill. It was terrible to watch. She could sense the feeling he was trying to get out, but with no breath reaching his vocal cords, he was mute. They asked him one more vital question that day. Do you remember the crash? No. They were desperate to discover better ways of communicating, so on the day he sat in a chair for the first time, they bought him a white wipe-off chart and a marker pen. Next day when they arrived, he was sitting in his chair, and crudely printed on the board was, Hello, Mum and Ernie. Glad you are here. Thanks for everything. Love, Trev. The first message released a cascade of relief. He had set to rest their worst fear, that his brain might be damaged. For the first time since the crash, Jill collapsed into tears of joy. Kes had just arrived from London, where Paul Hanley-Greaves had summoned him to his office. We want you to go to Paris and try to see Trevor, said Hanley-Greaves. And if you get in, make sure you tell him to say to anybody who questions him that he can't remember anything about it. Why? Kes asked, as a little alarm bell ringing inside me saying, Hold on a minute. What does he want me to say that for? Hanley-Greaves dismissed the question with, Oh, it's going to be best because of this drink thing. Tell him it's going to be all right. The boss is going to sort everything out. Tell Trevor that he's going to be looked after. Yeah, I'll say that then, Kes responded, but he had no intention of fulfilling the orders. Kes was happy to be in Paris, eager to escape the press coverage he knew would break over the next 2 days. His appearance on the American ABC network was widely quoted in British newspapers, and on Monday, the BBC would air its panorama show, Diana, Her Last Day, which was full of Kes. Nothing suggested Paul was drunk. He was just a nice guy, said Kes to the panorama cameras. He believed that to be true. But the candour of his other comments was mired in murk and ambiguity as he tried to please the boss without lying. Yes, Dodie had come up with a new plan with Henri Paul driving. And it was a good plan, and it did work, he affirmed, a statement that would make him cringe many times. Most helpful to Fayed was that Kes did not repeat Dodie and Henri Paul's claim that Fayed had approved the plan. Fayed would righteously tell the French judge that he had known nothing about the decision to ask Henri Paul to drive. He was adamant that he had not been consulted. Painting a vivid picture of escalating paparazzi harassment, Kes wound up his panorama interview with a ringing indictment. If anyone is blamed, it should be who was hounding the car. It had been building and came to a head that night. On Sunday, Jill and Ernie told Trevor what the papers were saying about Henri Paul being drunk. He only had 2 drinks, Trevor wrote, sending fear into his parents' heart. The Trevor they knew would never, never let anyone who'd been drinking take the wheel. Later, Kes calmed their fears, explaining that both of them had thought the drinks were just pineapple juice. On the Monday, Jill and Ernie were excited to be told that 2 major events in Trevor's recovery had occurred. The wires had been removed from his mouth. His jaws were still locked shut, but with exercise he could now begin to regain movement. And he had been fitted with a new tracheal tube that would enable him to speak. Wonderful, Jill and Ernie exclaimed. They couldn't wait to see him. When we walked into the room, he was trying to talk, desperately trying to form words, but until we became used to it, it was barely comprehensible. His interview with the judge was set for that Friday, the 19th of September. Now, flushed with his new powers, Trevor wanted to see Kes. I walked in and I couldn't believe it. He had this massive swollen head. He just looked like a pumpkin, as if someone had inflated his head. He was half sitting up, drooling from the mouth. We just sort of held hands for a minute. He couldn't open his jaw, so he was trying to write something, but he was getting frustrated because he couldn't write properly, so he was trying to say it. Finally, he got it down and showed it to Kes. That was some OT. OT was overtime. Kes got it instantly and burst out laughing. Well, it serves you right, you money-grabbing bastard, Kes snapped back. It was touching, really, because he was trying to laugh, but he couldn't, and I was wiping all this mess that was coming out of his mouth. When he started laughing, though, I knew his brain was okay. It was still Trev in there. He's going to mend. He's okay. That was fantastic. Crawford had found the right lawyer, he believed. Christian Kirtle, just 3 years out of law school, had dazzling credentials, a Master of Law from New York University, a top-ranked Doctorate of Laws from the Sorbonne, and he was a Secrétaire de la Conférence, selected in a highly prestigious competition which, each year, chose 12 young avocats to travel to 20 foreign cities representing the French bar. The impact was great, Crawford says, of this very young man guiding us into this imposing living room, a tableau of antique furniture, paintings, and collections of silver and porcelain gleaming from lit alcoves. Kirtle and his father, Michael, ran their law practice from offices across the hall from the salon. We're here, Crawford explained, because the judge expects to interview Trevor this Friday, and we're concerned because we do not know whether he will be interviewed as a witness or a suspect. I see no way he could be interviewed as a suspect, Kirtle speculated, but I know Hervé Stéphane, the juge d'instruction, personally, and will call on him tomorrow to inquire. Kirtle proposed an option that Trevor might become a partie civile, a status which lets direct victims, relatives of the victims, or anyone who had, say, a moral interest in the victim's issues, become full party to the case. As a partie civile, Trevor would have access to every document, every interview and scrap of evidence in the judge's investigation. On the matter of money, Crawford cautioned, Monsieur Kirtle, I see no way that we could promise you any payment for your contact with the judge or for work that might arise from it. The Rees-Jones family did not have the funds to mount a legal presence in Paris. I would be happy to do it free of charge and look at the position as it unfolds, Kirtle offered. To Ernie and Jill, he seemed a dream come true, and a year later, Crawford would say, I consider the best single move I made in this matter was to find Christian Kirtle to be Trevor's French lawyer. And the day after the meeting, Kirtle called Trevor's parents and reassured them. He will not be accused of anything. At least the judge will not accuse him. Maybe other parties, but not the judge. On Friday the 19th of September, the hospital entrance was surrounded. There were 100 journalists and a sea of satellite dishes. The most important witness to the crash was about to speak. Because Trevor's speech was still so indistinct, Jill and Ernie were permitted to be with him. Professor Jean-Jacques Ruby, chief of Réanimation, was at hand to halt the interview if Trevor seemed unwell. It took almost an hour, as the questions were lobbed back and forth in slow motion from judge to interpreter, to Trevor, to Ernie, to interpreter, and back to the judge. At the end of the interview, Trevor was drained. He had remembered very little. As he waited for the taped interview to be painstakingly hand-transcribed, Trevor hung his head in his hands. Only after he had signed each sheet of paper could he go back to bed. Within a day, this most secret of interviews had been published, word for word, in The Guardian and The Mirror. Ernie, enraged, called the police and told them, Your security is like a colander, full of holes. It was not us who leaked, the police explained. It could be the people working in the prosecutor's office. It could be the photographers. As partie civile, the photographers had access to the interview. Trevor had looked in the mirror for the first time. I wasn't horrified, but I was taken aback a fair bit. The worst was the teeth. All smashed at the front, all jagged. It didn't look nice. They could all see that his face was not yet right. It was out of line. Ciccani decided that the left part of my face needed fixing. He must pull the eye socket forward and fix the lopsidedness. As Trevor went into surgery again, David Crawford presented himself at the Klein Goddard law offices for a meeting with Theo Klein, two of his colleagues, and Monsieur Brisé, who, although representing Henri Paul's family, was apparently there on behalf of Mohammed Al-Fayed. Crawford had been called to Paris, he thought, to discuss compensation for Trevor's injuries. In a French industrial accident, there was usually an obligation on the part of the employer to compensate. What Crawford learned was that the obligation only arose if the employer was based in France. As Trevor was employed by an English company, he could not get compensation in this way. But compensation was not what the French lawyers had in mind. When I got there, I found we were talking, again, about an attempt to have Trevor represented by a lawyer of Fayed's choosing, with a promise of payment of his fees. Crawford thought this agenda had been put to rest at his last meeting, when he had asked Theo Klein outright, "Have you ever acted for Mohammed Al-Fayed?" Klein had said candidly, "Yes, I've done so, and if instructed, would do so again." Clearly their brief was to get Trevor as a client at any price. Well, so far as I was concerned, I wasn't for sale, nor was my client. The Fayed team finally agreed that, if approved, Fayed would pay the legal costs of the lawyer of Trevor's choice. But that agreement would last only so long as Trevor did not sue Fayed, did not speak to the press, and only if Trevor was not in any way responsible for the accident. It stripped Trevor of his freedom of action. It would be, they proposed, a secret agreement. That evening was Trevor's lowest point. He hadn't expected or wanted to face surgery again. It took 5 hours rather than the marathon 11 of the first session, but as Trevor woke up in the recovery room, still groggy, I was frightened. I couldn't breathe. I started panicking. My legs started kicking and my arms were flying. He was lying down, and the tracheal tube had blocked. Nurses rushed, cleared the line, but he felt absolutely and utterly worn out. I just felt I couldn't take much more of that. If there'd been an on-off button, I'd have pressed it then. He said to Jill and Ernie as they came in, "I've had enough." Chikani came in and, trying to stir the spirit he knew was still there, he told them, "We're kicking Trevor out by next weekend." Trev was coming home. But there was no excitement in Trevor. Not a sparkle, nothing, the parents observed. They were both down when they left the hospital to meet David back at the apartment. Things didn't improve when he told them about his meeting with Theo Klein and the other lawyers. As they heard it, Fayed's lawyers wanted Trevor to sign away any rights to contact the press at any time in exchange for job security and little else. The agreement would be secret, and Jill and Ernie must sign it too. "Blackmail," Ernie commented, his first expression of anything other than gratitude to Mr. Fayed. They felt that it was Trevor's decision. Trevor must accept or reject the agreement. Like a miracle, the next day was the best of days. Chikani had talked to Trevor again, and now he was thrilled that he'd be going home at the weekend. And the finest news of all, he would play rugby and work again as a bodyguard. It was the first time in 27 days that we'd seen Trevor laugh, says Jill. It was wonderful. Trevor's release was on the understanding that he would get proper medical care after he left. He would be taken direct to Oswestry, where a team of 4 specialists standing by to care for him would assess him and hospitalize him if necessary. Trevor was in no mood to discuss the agreement and the lawyers. He just kept saying, "I don't want to upset the boss. I don't want to upset the boss." Keeping the job was clearly paramount in his mind. Trevor would be leaving on Friday the 3rd of October. Frank Klein notified them that a Harrods helicopter would fly them all back to England. On the Thursday, Trevor had his second police interview. Jill and Ernie had their final meeting at the embassy and were warned to be very careful about what they said. Frank Klein called again. The organisation wanted to take Trevor to London, to a private hospital for 2 days of medical assessment and to meet Mr. Fayed. Ernie and Jill would stay at Park Lane. "If that's what the boss wants, I'll go for 2 days and then I want to go home," Trevor stated. Unhappily, Jill and Ernie felt forced to agree to the London detour. "But this isn't a hospital," said Ernie, alarmed as the car pulled into an underground garage on Park Lane. Though exhausted, his head splitting with pain, Trevor knew well enough where they were. Fayed's headquarters. In this state, he thought only, "This is fine. It'll be good to see the lads." Ernie and Jill were not so sanguine. Despite its luxury, the helicopter flight had been 2 hours of hell for Trevor, Jill knew. Now he desperately needed rest and medical care. "The doctors will come and see him here. We thought it would be more comfortable," Hanley Greaves explained. But the atmosphere made Jill and Ernie distinctly nervous as Paul ushered them into the heart of the Fayed empire, past security guards, cameras, doors locking behind them. It seemed like a luxurious prison, Jill observed. The boss wants to see Trevor for a few minutes, Hanley Greaves said, guiding their shuffling son out of the door. 10 minutes after Trevor had been taken away, Mohammed Al-Fayed himself swept in, waving his arms and billowing with words like a ship under full sail. "It's terrible, terrible, it's not an accident. No, no, it's a plot, an assassination, it's murder." He half sobbed as he raved on. These beautiful young people murdered before they could live their lives. Terrible. He was boiling up, shouting with frustration and emotion, obviously, with the loss of his son, and he just talked to Trevor. Jill and Ernie were tremendously taken aback. An assassination attempt? "Hang on, just a minute, we can't accept this," says Ernie. "Because if this is so, then Trevor is obviously very much at risk, even now." Yes, this is true, bellowed Fayed. "Well, in that case, we need to get the police here right now," said Ernie. No need, the boss declared as he strode out of the room, the whole astounding scene having taken place in no more than 2 minutes. Trevor had braced himself to face the boss's usual bluster. He's a very powerful man. You can't talk or hold a conversation with him. He talks at you. But this was a very different boss, a man in terrible distress. He was quite upset when he first saw me. He had tears in his eyes, and all I could do was apologize and say, "I'm sorry." He went on about having doctors there and care and so on, and I just said, "Yes, that's fine, that's fine." I felt indebted to him in a big way, and I felt sorry for him. I felt a bit of responsibility, because it was his son that had been killed. Hanley Greaves led him down a corridor and into a room where there were 3 doctors waiting to see me. Trevor was so completely shagged out that he meekly sat in a chair as they told him, "It'll just be 10 or 15 minutes, and explain what their roles were: a psychiatrist, a psychologist, and a general practitioner. No one ever said they were going to see if I could remember anything. It was never said at that meeting or any meeting, but that's what it felt like. They asked him questions, being quite solicitous. "Are you okay? Do you want to stop?" "No, I'm fine, keep going," Trevor would say. I just kept nodding. Yes, too tired to bother. Alone, Jill and Ernie looked at each other, truly frightened for the first time. It was obvious to us that you couldn't speak to Fayed as a rational person, Ernie says. And Trevor had not come back. He's had nothing to eat, no medication. We have all his painkillers and antibiotics. I'm going to look for Trevor, said Ernie. Don't worry, Trevor isn't very far away, said the bodyguard outside the door, as he discreetly pointed to a door down the corridor. In his diary, Ernie recorded, "On entering the room, I couldn't believe my eyes." What they'd got set up there in that room was Trevor, sitting on an upright chair being faced by 3 people that had never been introduced to us. A GP, a psychologist, and a psychiatrist, it was explained. As she followed Ernie into the room, Jill shuddered at the sight. All 3 of them were positioned around Trevor. It looked to me like an interrogation. A camera and video recording gear were in the room, but not the equipment for a full medical examination, and no bed. "Trevor's in no fit state for this," snapped Jill, drawing on the courage she could always find when Trevor's safety was at stake. "We understood he was going to be in hospital for 48 hours. Otherwise we'd have gone straight home. He's not fit. He's just not fit." "Fine, okay, that's grand," said the psychiatrist, showing some sympathy for the situation. "Come on, Trev. You need to take your medication," said Jill, her hands on his shoulders, as Trevor got up very unsteadily and moved towards the door. "Mr. Fayed is doing this for Trevor's best interests," said the general practitioner. Trevor was too drained to care, but he wanted to believe it. It was late. They put Trevor to bed with his sleeping tablets, painkillers, and antibiotics. For the night, they were trapped. As Paul Hanley Greaves arrived in the morning, he faced the determination that had driven their battle in Paris to save Trevor's life. "We want to leave by 1 p.m. It was an ultimatum, and Hanley Greaves acquiesced. "We'll take you home and send somebody with you to make sure he's okay." The single positive part of the nightmare was a visit of a maxillofacial surgeon. "Wonderful surgery, but the dentist is going to be busy," he told Trevor. "He's the man that showed us how to use wooden spatulas for the physiotherapy on Trevor's jaw," says Jill. "Trevor could only open his jaw about 1 centimetre. We had to push spatulas, tongue depressors into his mouth and try each day to increase the number. It was very painful, but if we didn't do it, the jaw would seize up and he'd never be able to open it. It would be locked forever." The visit took a fairly shattering 1.5 hours. Darren Wardman would be driving them, then staying with Trevor to help out. Then Kes would take over. For now, Jill and Ernie had suspended suspicion of Fayed's larger motives. They'd have Trevor at home. Sunday the 5th of October, 5 weeks to the day since the accident. Is it possible, Jill wondered, that life might return to normal? But for Trevor's homecoming, satellite stations had been set up in the market square in town, and interview requests were flooding into Harrods, the generic term Trevor's Oswestry team used for anything to do with the Fayed organisation. The family rule held, no interviews. But the reporters and TV crews who poured into Oswestry hammered on the door. I think I should still have been in hospital for another week or so at least, says Trevor looking back. I wasn't well at all. I think the only reason I was at home was that my mum was a qualified nurse. His scars must be massaged and softened or they'd never fade. He must force himself to walk, each step a jarring pain. They must work relentlessly on getting his jaw open. The powerful painkillers Chicani had given him had run out. The local replacements couldn't control the headaches. At 4:30 one night, Jill found him in such a state, saying, I can't sleep. His recovery was measured by spatulas, by the number they could stack in his mouth as they tried to pry open his jaws. It was agony for Trevor. They started with 7 the first day, forcing his jaws open for 6 minutes, increasing it 1 spatula at a time. We got up to 9 that day. The goal was 24. They became our milestone, said Jill. They were also chauffeuring him back and forth to doctors, oral surgeons, ophthalmologists. He still had metal staples ear to ear from the second facial surgery and an infected scar. There was more eye and wrist surgery ahead and his teeth to be rebuilt. The 11th of October, the Saturday following his return, was a day of triumph for Trevor's recovery. Today they successfully inserted 14 spatulas. It was also a day of triumph for recovering his life. He returned to the rugby club for the first time. This was a moment Jill had prayed for, but dreaded. At home in the town, he was the wounded hero. But here, in the club where his athleticism and personality had earned him his place, how would he feel? How would the lads feel? Hey, the crash test dummy just walked in, said one of the lads as he entered. The piss-taking had begun. Trevor shuffled to the bar, and they gave him an absolutely overwhelming welcome. For lawyers, the French system held one massive limiting factor. Once the prosecutor had named the focus of the criminal investigation, the paparazzi in this case, the pursuit and testing of their guilt was the only line of investigation the judge could follow. The trick was to subtly try to expand the case by looking for anything the judge had not yet targeted for investigation, and make a compelling request that it be explored. Christian must comb every piece of paper as it entered the file, looking for contradictions, surprises, anything that might push the investigation in the direction of his client's interests. His search was driven by a single question. Who is responsible for the damage done to my client? Then he must assess compensation for Trevor. From the first, I didn't think there was a case against the photographers. Henri Paul's drunkenness overwhelmed all other evidence, but you couldn't sue a dead man. Trevor had no case against Henri Paul. Christian noted that several photographers described Trevor being friendly to them. He had smiled, shaken their hands. This was the technique Trevor and Kes had successfully used to defuse the explosive situation on the day of the crash, trying to disarm the paparazzi into cooperation. But might Trevor's friendliness be seen as encouraging the paparazzi? Christian and Ian Lucas discussed by phone how to coordinate media for the Rees-Joneses. From the beginning, Christian probably felt we should be giving out more news, Ian noted. They'll write something anyway, let's control it, was Christian's argument, but the family wanted nothing released. Before the summer, Trevor had been ready to move into a small red brick bungalow just a mile from Jill and Ernie's. The owner had held onto it for him when he heard about the accident, but now it was time for Trevor to become independent. He could move into it at the end of November, if he was able. On Friday, the 28th of November, Trevor spent his first night in his new home. Emotionally, it was a huge tug for me, Jill said. I know it's an illogical response, but as a mother I felt, oh gosh, is my little boy going to be all right? He was so alone. After all Jill's worry, Trevor was just fine. After a couple of days there, I realized it was the best thing I ever did. I had no reason to be nervous. End of side 3.
Side 4. By February 1998, Trevor was well enough to be back at work. He walked into 60 Park Lane for his first day of work just 5 months after the crash. It was part-time. Just working on the ops desks at 60 Park Lane, basically logging phone calls and radio messages. But he was back. On the 2nd of February, he had his second session with a psychiatrist. He also talked to Fired again. I talked to the boss quite often. I saw him twice, even 3 times a week during this period. And he would say various things like, "What do you think about this, about that? Do you remember this? Do you remember that?" Every time he saw me, he would start getting tears in his eyes. He was distraught. So I'm not going to say to him, "You're talking a load of bollocks." I would say, "Yes, that's a possibility. Of course it's a possibility." He called home every 2 or 3 days. "The work's been okay," he'd say, but they could tell. Trevor was shattered. When Ernie picked him up from the train on the 6th of February, their worries increased. The Sun was coming to Oswestry to do a photo story arranged by Harrods. Still at home in Oswestry, Trevor rang up on Tuesday the 10th of February to tell Ernie that the Sun photo shoot had been in town that day. Next day I picked up a paper fearing the worst, and Trevor was all over the inside pages. Ernie confided wearily to his diary, "It never ends. On Thursday, February the 12th, the Mirror newspaper has the first 5 pages devoted to Trevor's boss, Al Fayed, who makes ridiculous claims about Dodie and Diana, and also about Trevor, about what he can remember. Trevor has no memory of the crash, and could not have said these things." Fayed had given Mirror editor Piers Morgan what was touted as the first newspaper interview he had granted since the accident, a sensationalized 3-part story. In it, Fayed unleashed his frustration and grief and his suspicions. "I believe in my heart, 99.9%, that it was not an accident. There was a conspiracy, and I will find the person who caused this accident. I will not sleep. I will not rest until I have done so." Fayed's Mirror interview bristled with other claims. Trevor and Kes knew most of them to be inaccurate, if not outright fantasies. Fayed revealed Diana's last words given to him by a nurse outside the operating theatre, where Diana had died, and told Piers Morgan, "I last spoke to Dodie 15 minutes before the accident and said to him, 'Now look, don't do any tricks when you leave the hotel. Go out the front door and say hello. Talk to the paparazzi.'" Fayed claimed that Trevor had heard Diana's voice in the crashed car. Trevor remembers her saying, "Where is Dodie? Where is Dodie?" Fayed boasted. Trevor has been seeing 2 psychiatrists, and he remembers more every time. Yes, Trevor had had a sort of dream, heard a voice. The boss was so hungry for memories and he wanted to help. But it was only a single word, Dodie, and Trevor didn't trust it to be a true memory. Now, in print for all England to read, the boss had distorted their half-dozen agitated exchanges over the past few weeks into this. Fayed put him in the story too, to defend Henri Paul. "Trevor is one of my top guys, and if he had spotted anything untoward about Henri Paul, he would not have allowed him to drive that car. As long as Trevor worked for Fayed and served his purposes, he was safe," Christian suspected. But this praise for Trevor could be reversed very quickly, he feared, if Fayed ever felt the need for another scapegoat. On the 23rd of February, Trevor was sent for his 3rd meeting with the psychiatrist near the boss's office. "I dreamed things. I must have mentioned to the doctor having these vague recollections or dream-type things and said to him, 'Sometimes I think they're true. Sometimes I think they're suspect. I don't really believe them.' These post-trauma memories were likely to be unreliable," the psychiatrist confirmed. This guy never pressed for memories. He was a spot-on man, a smashing bloke, in Trevor's view. Frustrating though it may be for Fayed, the psychiatrist's belief that Trevor's post-trauma memories are unlikely to be reliable is the common expert view. There is wide consensus that the kind of amnesia and memory disturbances that Trevor experiences are extremely common. This kind of retrograde amnesia, forgetting events that happened in the seconds or minutes just before a head trauma, and having a patchy memory for events prior to that, is totally expected in even minor crashes, says Daniel L. Schachter, professor and chair of Harvard University's Department of Psychology. In this case, with massive swelling on the brain and prolonged unconsciousness, It would be stunning if it didn't happen. The reasons why he has a 3-minute memory gap are less well understood, but most of us see it as a failure of the last 3 minutes to consolidate in the brain's long-term memory, Schachter adds, the process interrupted by the violent assault to the head. Memory loss for the few minutes before the trauma is almost always permanent. After his latest session with the psychiatrist, Trevor went back to his quarters, and within 10 minutes the doctor and Paul Hanley-Greaves were at the door. "I've just seen Mr. Fayed and he's upset," the doctor told Trevor. "He thinks you remember things and I told him you don't. I'm confused. Do you or don't you?" "No, I don't," said Trevor. Fayed wanted to see them. The three of them now marched up to the boss's office for a chat. His main thing then was to prove that this wasn't an accident. So far as I was concerned, it was just a crash, but the boss wanted more and bombarded Trevor. "Trevor, do you remember a Fiat Uno? We know who was following you during the trip. Do you remember a flash?" All the times he said to the boss, "That's a possibility," in response to Fayed's cockeyed theories were coming back to haunt him. When I'm saying, "Maybe it's a possibility," he's taking it as, "Yes, I agree with you." Trevor now insisted to the boss, "I said before that anything's a possibility. I never said I remembered. I don't remember anything but getting into the car back at the Ritz." "I can't understand why your memory's not come back. You're getting better now," Fayed barked at Trevor. His frustration turning to fury, he stormed at the doctor. "What's wrong with him?" The boss was not to be cheated of the cornerstone of his strategy. He needed it, now, to divert the press. He was in trouble over the breaking into of Tiny Roland's safety deposit box at Harrods in December 1995, and was about to be humiliated by being forced to present himself at Kennington Police Station for questioning on the matter. He was also in noisy litigation with Vanity Fair over a story which had charged him with racist employment policies and sexual harassment at Harrods. Paul Hanley-Greaves, too, would be submitting himself with Fayed at the police station for his alleged role in the break-in. 2 nights after Trevor's brouhaha with Fayed and the psychiatrist, Hanley-Greaves was on another assignment for the boss. He suggested, Trevor recalls, that obviously the boss was under fire, feeling victimized, and would I be prepared to do something for him? You know, do an interview and mention these memories. These memories were something Trevor wished he'd kept to himself. "I've always said I was unsure of this woman's voice saying, 'Dodie.' Looking back, it can't be true, and as soon as I said it, I totally regretted it. I sat down and thought, to be honest, what harm is it going to do? I won't lie about anything. I'm not going to say anything to upset the princess's family. I don't want to do this, but I wanted to help the boss." "Yes, I'll do this interview," Trevor told Hanley-Greaves when he rang the next morning, Thursday the 26th of February. "I accepted it. I accepted a lot of things at that time because I felt a need to help Fayed. All I wanted was to stay at work." Mid-morning, Trevor got a call. "The boss wants to see you at Harrods." I went across to Harrods and saw Piers Morgan with a photographer, Mr. Fayed, and the Director of Security, John McNamara. The main thing Piers Morgan wanted was the so-called memory of Diana's voice. At that stage, even though I was desperate to remember something, I told him I was not very certain myself. "I hope this isn't going to come out until I've seen the judge. Legally, I've got to tell him these things first," Trevor said at the end of the interview. To be honest, the minute I'd done it, I'd regretted it. He called David Crawford and told him what happened. Crawford called Ian Lucas. It was outrageous, both lawyers agreed. "We've been trying to keep control. We had it until Trevor went back to work," says Lucas. Their client was clearly just a pawn in the game. Trevor had told the Mirror not to publish until after his appearance before the judge. Fayed was scheduled to testify on March the 12th, Trevor on the 16th of March. On Friday, the 27th of February, Trevor took the train home. He'd just heard from Paul Hanley-Greaves that Sue was selling her story. He couldn't believe it. Sue? Sue's story ran in the News of the World a few weeks later on the 15th of March. Trevor had helped Fayed again, when he'd had a call from Harrods saying that the pictures of him with Piers Morgan hadn't come out, and would he mind if they sent another photographer up to Oswestry? How can I say no when I've said yes to everything else, Trevor thought. But they arrived with a TV crew as well, and he refused to talk on camera. They finally settled for a video of him walking across a park. That night, his walk was splashed across Sky TV with a promo for his story in the Mirror launching the next day. On Saturday, the 28th of February, Trevor's face, scars and all, duly filled the front page of the Mirror. "I survived," the headline screamed. The subhead proclaimed, "Exclusive, Diana's bodyguard, Trevor Rees-Jones, tells his own story." Inside were 2 pages pitching the 3-part series that would begin on Monday with "The year's most astonishing interview." For Trevor, this leader in the Mirror is where I began to lose faith in the boss. And inside was the worst, a very presentable half-page photograph of Piers Morgan and himself at an elegant large desk in Harrods with a tape recorder between them. He'd been completely conned. Harrods had treated him like a fool. "From that point on, I felt cheated," said Trevor. He called Hanley Greaves and declared that he, Trevor, was now at liberty to talk to whoever he wished. He called David, who urged him to get down to the office. Ian Lucas and David Crawford were furious when they saw the Mirror. It implied they bought Trevor's story, says Ian, and the media were now on the doorstep demanding a story too. As England waited for the sensational series to begin on Monday, an urgent secret drama was unfolding by phone and fax between London and Oswestry. 2 things were of great concern to Trevor, Ian explains. First was the perception that he was going to be profiting from the crash. Even Sue, his ex-wife, was selling her story. The second thing was that he still wanted to maintain his relationship with Fayed. Trevor was the client, they had to respect his wishes, but several points had to be made public fast. That the story was not exclusive, that Trevor had been told there would be nothing published before he saw the judge or without his lawyer's approval, and that he hadn't been paid a penny. At 1:26 p.m, Ian faxed a tough and candid press release to Fayed's press office. Paul Hanley Greaves called, aggressive about what he claimed was an error. No, Fayed was not in the room through the whole interview, as the statement claimed. "Is he right?" Ian asked Trevor. He crossed it out with his pencil when Trevor confirmed it. Fayed's chief London lawyer, Stuart Benson, called and faxed to correct untruths about the psychiatrist. No, Trevor had not seen a psychiatrist at Fayed's request, in an attempt to remember more of the events of the 31st of August, as the release said, but solely for his own good. That too was softened. As Trevor blue-penciled, the statement was progressively diluted. Trevor wouldn't let us be as tough as we wanted to be, Ian fretted, but he saw that they had a little leverage to exploit. Harrods were trying to keep us on side because they knew that Trevor was in Oswestry now, physically with us. We had physical control of him. We were urging him to resign. We were spinning out of control because this Mirror thing had happened. If he'd just said, "I resign," we could have recovered the situation. We wouldn't have needed to say anything. But Trevor refused. He wanted to keep in with Fayed. The fallback was a leave of absence, if only Trevor would agree to take it. Eventually, we got a press release out around tea time on Saturday. It was sent to the Press Association. "I wish to explain how the interview with Mr. Piers Morgan took place and make absolutely clear that I have received no payment from the interview and indeed have never received any payment from the press," it began. Trevor chided Piers Morgan. "I understand that the Mirror contacted other press outlets last night claiming rights over an exclusive article, without contacting me or my solicitors. The result has been to make my life hell for the last 24 hours. The first media calls with offers to buy Trevor's story started within the hour. At 8:30 on Saturday night, Piers Morgan phoned. He was happy to give us a statement making it clear that it was not exclusive, that Trevor had not been paid, and to send us every word that was going to be published so that we could check it first. He agreed to pay legal costs in connection with the articles, later agreed at £10,000. He knew he was in a very difficult position. He'd been thinking he had the greatest scoop in the world, and it was about to collapse around his ears. We could get anything we wanted. Morgan also let a few things slip. When Ian told him that Trevor was very upset because he'd not been shown the content of the interview, Morgan professed amazement. "I sent every word of the piece through to Mr. Fayed for his approval. I thought that Trevor had approved it." When Ian and David finally dragged themselves down the stairs and onto the dark street at 10:30 that evening, they had to elbow through a scrum of cameras and reporters. An even larger scrum would greet them next day, Sunday the 1st of March. The press release made it clear that there was no exclusive deal, and the press assumed that Trevor was up for grabs. It triggered a bidding war. The Sun opened with £50,000 and quickly moved up to £200,000, with other papers and networks coming in with competing bids. The lawyers were not about to turn them down lightly. Trevor's the pauper here, Ian was thinking. Lots of other people had sold their story. They had to represent Trevor's interests responsibly. The lawyers had their own interests too. The one and only payment of legal fees they'd received had come from Fired on Friday, under terrific Mirror pressure, even though they had a costs contract signed by Stuart Benson for Fired. They were long since committed to going forward with Trevor on principle regardless, but it would be nice. While Ian fielded the bids, Trevor and David Crawford were feverishly editing the first story due to appear next day. Trevor's letting too much through in an effort to please the boss, Ian feared, glancing over the final product. Monday's headline would read, "I heard Diana call out for Dodie after the crash." The story went on, "I have had flashes of a female voice calling out in the back of the car. First it's a groan, then Dodie's name is called. It could only have been Princess Diana. I was conscious and so was she." Trevor was playing into Fired's strategy of the great romance. He was letting through a statement that even the psychiatrist felt was open to question. Through an intense afternoon, they toyed with what to them was a fortune. When you added up the various offers to buy Trevor's story, it came to roughly £500,000. But as much as he wanted Trevor to break free of Fired, Ian felt obliged to tell him, if you sell an interview to The Sun spiking the Mirror story, it would blow Fired's media strategy out of the water. Your relationship with Fired would be terminated. Trevor decided to reject all bids and stay with the Mirror. "I turned down £500,000 in an afternoon," Trevor mused. "I was happy to. I didn't want it." 2 weeks later, Trevor would just as easily turn down a written offer of $1 million from the American tabloid The National Enquirer. Trevor's 30th birthday began with the paper blaring out, "Mum took my hand and said, 'There is no easy way of telling you this. Diana and Dodie are both dead.'" That powerful moment turned into such maudlin trash. Photos of the whole family were inside. Trevor's lawyers cringed as the expected critical attacks on the Mirror series rolled in. Trevor's being perceived as being a Fired puppet, Ian worried. Also, he'd spilled his story before he had given these new memories to the judge's investigation. His final interview was the following week. The judge might see him as unreliable, and that could hurt the good opinions his lawyers had worked so hard to maintain. The three lawyers knew that Trevor must be seen as contrite, but above all, as independent of Fired. Ian rang Christian with an idea. "Can Trevor go to see the judge earlier than the appointment?" Christian won a meeting 2 days hence. But Fired must not know that Trevor had initiated the meeting, they believed, or he would increase the pressure on Trevor. They devised a cover for the Paris trip. "We were spinning to the press that the judge was hauling Trevor across the channel to give him a real dressing down for giving the interview," says Ian. "Meanwhile, we were also making it clear to Fired and Harrods that the judge was hopping mad and that Trevor had to go to see him on Friday." In fact, the judge was unhappy, but he wasn't that unhappy, says Christian with a slight smile. Trevor's passage to Paris had been tightly planned. David would drive him to Paris via the Channel Tunnel, but the plan collapsed the night before when Trevor cancelled. Distressed, David had called Ian from London. "Trevor's just told me that Harrods have made arrangements for his transport to Paris." To the lawyers, this was tantamount to kidnap. Racing to Paris, David had failed to intercept Trevor before he was whisked by the Ritz limousine to the Bodyguard's quarters at the Villa Windsor. Trevor felt none of his lawyer's urgency. The suggestion came up at work that I go across with Darren and spend the night at the villa, which I was happy to do. At the end of the day, I was happier to be travelling and having a laugh with a mate than to spend that time with my solicitors. Who wouldn't be? I was getting fed up to the back teeth with them. The three lawyers were now convinced that the battle for control of Trevor had escalated into open warfare. But early on the morning that Trevor was to go to the courts, an event occurred at the Villa Windsor which caused the sole survivor to move towards independence from Fired. The loss of trust had continued to build since the Mirror story, and events that morning convinced him it was time to act on his concerns. He had been confronted with a letter Frank Klein urged him to sign. Trevor was outraged. They were asking me to sign a letter which basically said I want Christian Kirtle to investigate the crash and David and Ian to sort out things in Britain. They didn't want them to have contact. I absolutely lost my temper. I swore at them. How dare you? These are my lawyers. I refuse to sign it. This letter was finally it. I just felt totally used by Fayed. The court was a mob scene worse than the 19th of December. Hundreds of TV crews, hundreds of cameras, plus the radio, worldwide press. They filled the corridors and the entrance, the whole drive. The judge was as mild as Christian had expected. He was slightly annoyed that he didn't get to speak to me first, Trevor recalls. But I told the judge directly that the things I'd been reported to remember, the voice, I didn't believe myself, really. As he left, a contrite Trevor reassured the judge that if he felt he had anything more to say, he would make sure he spoke to him first. Trevor recalls, I got back to London late that afternoon and the boss wanted to see me at Oxted. Trevor was led to the boss's big tent out on the lawn, and Trevor could see he wasn't happy at all. Fayed attacked Ian and David. Your lawyers, they're small-town lawyers. They don't know what they're doing. They're not representing you properly. I'm happy with them. I'm happy with you. You betrayed me. You wouldn't sign the letter. You fought with Frank Klein. I don't believe you can accuse me of disloyalty, Trevor retorted, trying to hold his temper. I've done nothing against you. I haven't done anything. My solicitors thought, and a lawyer at Harrods thought, it was a good idea for me to be seen to be independent. The boss was fuming now, sort of chanting, implying an ultimatum, be loyal or leave. Do you want me to make a decision now if I'm going to leave work or not? Because I'll make a decision. I'll stand up and walk out of here. Trevor was getting up to leave as Paul Hanley-Greaves intervened, calming the boss down. I'm asking for a leave of absence, Trevor told the boss. As Trevor left the tent, the boss, still seated, called out a civil farewell. Fine, take care of yourself. On the 12th of March, the boss was in Paris for his interview with the judge. The following day, Christian got a transcript of Fayed's testimony and dashed a report off to David. On Trevor, there is absolutely nothing since he did not even mention him. Instead, he talked about the excellent job he felt that Stéphane was doing and expressed his faith in the French judicial system. Then he said that he could not say anything concerning Henri Paul other than that he was a very professional employee about whom he had no complaint. Christian saw in Fayed's ignoring Trevor and praising Paul the seeds of later attack. The three lawyers were in agreement. They could not continue to risk their own reputations by representing a man who was perceived to be in Fayed's pocket. He must resign, or you're on your own, mate, as Ian put it. On the 30th of March, Christian drafted a tough 5-page letter to Trevor in which he warned Trevor that, since the conspiracy theory no longer seems to be credible, he and David Crawford thought Fayed was trying to build a case that Trevor had failed to do his job responsibly, that he should have stopped Henri Paul from driving, not had his seatbelt fastened, not permitted such speed, and so on. What Christian saw was the beginning of an orchestrated campaign against you, and Fayed is trying to control what you say to the press, thus controlling the investigation. I'm not trying to put you under pressure, but it is my duty to warn you that I don't want to compromise my professional integrity, and if you choose to stay with Mr. Al-Fayed, I might even be forced to ask you to be represented by another lawyer. During these final days of painful decision-making, Trevor was deeply impressed by something one of the lads at work had said. Trev, you've been given a second chance. You should be enjoying every single day you wake up. You should be happy. You're not, are you? No, I'm not, said Trevor. Don't trust those bastards up there, his friend had said. The only agenda they've got is their own. They don't care about you. If I was you, I'd never have come back. So I resigned. I really feel that if they'd done things differently, I would still be there and willing to help. I think the whole episode was handled badly in the way they constantly put pressure on me. They would always want more, and I suppose that since the Mirror interview they felt they could get it. Ian Lucas sent out a press release announcing Trevor's resignation. I wish to move forward in my life after the tragic events of last August. It is for this reason that I have decided, with regret, to end my present employment. I wish to thank my employers and Mr. Mohammed Al-Fayed personally for the help and support they have given me through this very difficult time." Fayed's London lawyer, Stuart Benson, replied that Mr. Fayed was very sorry to learn of Trevor's decision and would be delighted to re-employ him at a later date. He also informed the lawyers that Fayed would no longer pay legal costs. Ian and David were mildly amused. He'd only paid once, under pressure during the Mirror episode. With Trevor's resignation, Christian Kirtle's concerns about Fayed attacking Trevor grew. Christian feared Trevor could become the lightning rod for Fayed's frustrations, as Judge Stefan's investigation was giving Fayed no fuel for the conspiracy theory that consumed him. The investigation was putting more pressure on the Ritz. Judge Stefan had hauled the usual cast of Ritz and Etoile characters, Klein, Roulet, Musa, Dorneau, in for another round of interviews. Kirtle saw opportunity in this new round of interviews, both to protect Trevor from Fayed and to get him some well-deserved damages. They could be the source of evidence that Trevor's life had been put wrongfully at risk. But the judge's late April interviews did not give Christian enough evidence to file a complaint. Yet the threat from Fayed was dramatically increased as the lawyers got word of what was happening to Kes. Kes resigned on the 2nd of June after a stormy showdown with Fayed. For the first time, Fayed had abusively accused the bodyguards of causing the crash. The outburst had been triggered by Kes refusing to do another TV conspiracy show for him, and by his saying to the boss, "May I be frank? I don't agree at all with the conspiracy rubbish. It was just an accident." According to Kes, Fayed exploded at this. "How the fuck could you let this happen? You two idiots are to blame." He began to rant about Trevor and said, "That bastard has my curse. He was supposed to be loyal and he's fucking left me. I have paid for the best fucking psychiatrist in the country and they say he's fine." Fayed's ranting had gone on to conspiracy again, blaming the British government, Prince Philip, and the security services for the crash. In his fury, he was bundling the bodyguards and conspiracy together into a mad package of blame. Fayed threatened Kes with doing the television program or losing his job, and Kes resigned. Kes would explain his resignation to the judge on the 3rd of July. "My employer is convinced that the Princess of Wales and his son were the victims of a plot, and he expected me to support this idea, which it was not possible for me to do in all honesty." Kes eagerly called Trevor to share the moment, and wondered aloud to him, "You don't think he'll go after us, do you?" Trevor had said, No, still wanting to think the best of the boss. Then, on the heels of Kes's resignation, there was the confrontation between the photographers and the Partie Civile on the 5th of June in Paris. Fayed followed an outburst in court in which he condemned the photographers as vultures, with a ruthless attack on Diana's mother in front of the press. "She's a snob. She thinks she is the Queen of Sheba," he raved. "She walked out on her family and I don't give a damn about her." Christian read the transcript the following day. He wrote to David. One interesting question was raised by Keeman to Rutt, asking him to confirm that Trevor told the photographers that they were not bothering the couple, and that they could take pictures as long as they did not come too close. Rutt confirmed that comment. The question underlined Christian's fears, since it obviously protects the photographers and suggests that Trevor encouraged them. It's as if there was a shift towards an allegation of guilt on Trevor. On the 30th of June, Christian filed a request to Judge Stefan for new interrogations of Ritz and Etoile officials and drivers, hoping to catch the men in contradictions and have them incriminate each other. Pressure was building like Paris's summer heat towards the 31st of August, the first anniversary of Diana's death. For Trevor, that summer, he never seemed to be through with the operations. He'd have 2 wrist operations, 2 to remove plates from the side and below his left eye, and a series of oral surgeries before he was through. But he was working steadily towards a major goal. It was less than a year since he'd been cut out of the Mercedes when he returned to the rugby pitch. It was only half a match for Oswestry's second team, but it was within 12 months of the accident, says Trevor. As he entered the first scrum, he congratulated himself. "Good on you, Trevor, you've done it. Back on the pitch within a year." On the 25th, the Ritz Etoile team were interviewed again. And as he read the statements, Christian smiled with satisfaction. Here in abundance were the contradictions and buck-passing he had suspected. Here was Étoile director Neil Seagull confirming that although he was absent that night, he'd never been asked by the Ritz to provide a car without a driver, that he would normally have refused, but that, in this particular case, since it was Dodie Fayed who was asking, he might have accepted. An admission that he would have abandoned professional policy to please Fayed's son. He also said that at least 2 legally licensed drivers, Moussa and Lucar, were there and could have driven. Here was the Ritz's assistant manager, Claude Roulet, backing away from any responsibility for decisions, saying it was Dodie and the bodyguards who took the decision that Henri Paul was to drive. Above all, here was Frank Klein targeting the bodyguards, a preview of Fayed's strategy, Christian felt sure. He admitted that Henri Paul never drove clients, but also said that there was no spare driver for the car. He'd asked a night security man, Thierry Rocher, if he had given the order, said Klein, and Rocher had said no. It was the bodyguards who had gone outside the hotel, pointed their fingers at Henri Paul and told him he was to drive. With these interviews, the gross cause, Henri Paul's drunkenness, could no longer be seen in isolation from the contributing factors. They spread cause and guilt beyond 2 dead men and absolved the photographers from narrow culpability. The picture being painted was of broken rules and bad decisions driven by fear at every level of the chain of command, with fear of Fayed at the top. The evidence was hardening for a complaint. The first anniversary was almost upon them. The media had been pressing us for months to make a contribution to this anniversary period, says Christian. Holding his course, Trevor would give no interview. A positive decision, Christian felt, but we now had to do something. Christian, it was decided, would give cautious interviews on Trevor's behalf. CBS's Jackie Jabara won an interview, an exclusive for the US, and says Christian, during the month of August, I gave something like 60 interviews to the international press. Ian was arranging the one thing it was agreed Trevor would do, a brief televised statement which would be released to everyone at the same time. The TV cameras shot Trevor at Ian's desk. I have at the front of my mind the fact that 3 people were killed in the accident last August. On this, the first occasion that I have spoken publicly, I wish to extend my sympathy to the families and friends of those killed. I ask you to appreciate that the next month will be a difficult time for the relatives of those killed in the accident last August. It will also be a difficult time for me and my family. I ask you all to respect our privacy at this time and allow us to deal with the anniversary in our own way. 3 days before the anniversary, on the 27th of August, Fayed launched his public attack on the bodyguards. Time magazine hit the newsstands in the US 4 days ahead of its regular Monday publication date with a first anniversary report on the crash. In it, Fayed was quoted, "I am not on good terms with them, the bodyguards. I didn't want them to leave because the investigation is still running and I need them. But they are the people who caused the devastation and the accident through their incompetence and unprofessional practices. They had rules and they moved away from the rules. They let me down." As the frontal attack the lawyers had expected finally came, Trevor could not share Kez's fury. But I do find it disappointing that he changed from thinking I was the best thing since sliced bread and has suddenly turned his attack against me and Kez. I think it's sad. On the 23rd of September, Christian filed the long-planned complaint with the prosecutor against the Ritz and Étoile for the criminal offence of endangering a person. It asked the judge to charge the hotel and the limousine company with criminal responsibility for Trevor's injuries. Trevor might have agonized less about filing the complaint if he'd seen CNN's The Death of a Princess aired in August to commemorate the anniversary. When he did finally see a video in mid-October, allegations of his own guilt turned his previous disappointment into outrage. In The Death of a Princess, Fayed focused his attack specifically on Trevor. His incompetence, his unintelligent approach. You know, he put the seatbelt on. He didn't ask them to put the seatbelt on. He has a bulletproof car there in the hotel, which I use from time to time, or the VIPs of the hotel. He has not used that bulletproof car. But, said CNN's co-host Judd Rose, Al-Fayed's main complaint, he says, he paid Rees-Jones's medical expenses only to see him quit after he recovered. Said Fayed, in the hospital for 6 months, day and night with his family, because he was the only hope to tell me the truth, and I am confident that this boy is recovered now and he knows exactly what happened." "Why wouldn't he just come forward and say?" Rose asked. "Because he's been influenced by other persons." Moving the interview to conspiracy, Rose asked, "Do you still believe your son and the princess were assassinated?" "Definitely, definitely," said Fayed. Watching the video triggered an outburst that had been building since Trevor's parents had read him the early criticism by experts in hospital a year earlier. "What makes me annoyed, not angry but really annoyed, is when I watch these two blokes who were former heads of security for Fayed and Harrod say security was a shambles. They've worked for Fayed. They know what happens. As for Fayed paying Trevor's medical expenses, yes, he put my parents up in Paris. Yes, he flew them across there, and he was fantastic to us, to them. But Mum and Ernie signed a form which claims for our National Health Service," Trevor pointed out. Through one of Christian's contacts in Paris, they'd learned that the British Health Service had paid the entire hospital bill, except for a nominal 70 francs a day. Fayed's bill for the hospital was less than £320. A week later, the main attack on Trevor's actions during the blank last 3 minutes was routed. The police report on the crashed Mercedes, due to be released on the 1st of November, had been leaked to the press and had one extraordinary finding. Trevor had not been wearing a seatbelt at the time of the crash. The early report from the scene that had launched attacks on his professionalism had been false. Christian's delight could scarcely be suppressed as he reported the findings. The seatbelt is in perfect shape and cannot have been fastened. There is a light scratch showing that Trevor may have tried to put it on when seeing the crash coming. Trevor had been vindicated as a bodyguard. He had deprived his critics of one of their principal weapons of attack. On the 12th of December, Fayed went before the judge with a plea to pursue his conspiracy theory more aggressively. He urged the judge to investigate 2 MI6 agents he claimed were in Paris at the British Embassy at the time of the crash, and nagged the judge to confront the embassy with whether or not the British government had sent its assassins out to kill the princess. Fayed went on to say that he intended to obtain access to a 1,056-page CIA file on the private life of Diana. Convinced it would break the investigation wide open, he hoped to liberate the file from America and have it included as evidence. Though he would soon succeed in having an American court grant him access to Diana's file, Judge Stefan would refuse to include it in the case, tossing this entire line of investigation on the trash heap. On the 29th of January 1999, the complete report and the conclusions of the police investigation were hand-delivered by courier to the prosecutor and to the lawyers for each of the parties civile. The investigation was over. On the 17th of August 1999, 6 months after the report had been handed to her, the prosecutor, Madame Cujar, released her decision that all criminal charges against the photographers and the motorcyclist be dismissed. After 2 years and 10,000 pages, she had found insufficient evidence to support the suspicions that had driven and shaped the investigation. The direct cause of the accident is the presence at the wheel of the Mercedes S280 of a driver who had consumed a considerable amount of alcohol, combined with medication driving at a speed. Therefore, the loss of control of the vehicle by the driver in the Alma Tunnel constitutes the main cause of the accident. The accident was involuntary, a wounding blow to conspiracy theories. Madame Cujar had dismissed Trevor's complaint, but overall, Christian was very proud. Madame Cujar had named some of the interrelated factors Christian believed had contributed to the crash. She had clearly heard Trevor's complaint, and his and Kez's testimony about Dodi's responsibility for the plan. The report identified divergence in the stories told by Ritz management and Etoile boss Jean-François Mouzat regarding pre-crash decisions. Christian avidly read a paragraph which revealed an incestuous relationship between the two companies that made Mouzat and the Etoile drivers de facto employees of the Ritz, subject to orders from its bosses, a link that gave Dodi, it said, as a last resort, the power to decide all matters. In the light of the chain of command that lay exposed, Fayed's statement to the judge on the 11th of December was now ludicrous. He had said then that on the day of the accident, Trevor was the only one in charge of security, and that he had all powers he needed to take whatever security measures he saw fit. Christian Kirtle waited for the other shoe to drop. In a week or so, the judge would give his response to the decision. Judge Stefan had the power still to overrule the prosecutor and charge anyone he wished. It is now for the examining judge to decide what to do, and he is not bound by the prosecution's advice. He told me he would give his decision the first week of September, Christian told Trevor in a 29th of August letter. He also warned Trevor that the judge's decision is unfortunately not the end of it. The Spencers might do nothing. They had been completely passive so far, but one thing is sure. Fayed and the Pauls will appeal against any decision which does not charge at least 6 or 7 photographers with manslaughter. The risk is that Fayed tries to charge you during that trial. Please be sure I am perfectly aware of your desire to bring this to an end at last and not to appear too aggressive against this man. But if I were you, I would appeal this decision, at least to protect myself. On the 3rd of September, the other shoe dropped, but not quite as Christian had predicted. Stefan, too, dismissed all charges against the photographers, upholding the prosecution's decision. The judge blamed the crash on the drunken driving of Henri Paul, caused by Doty's decision to put him at the wheel. The report was a near duplicate of the prosecution's, but the photographers were not blameless. The judges pointed the finger at behavior which raised moral and ethical questions and claimed the photographers' continuous and insistent presence had led Doty Fayed to make decisions that, however imprudent, were a response to being hounded. Trevor's complaint was dismissed. There would be no criminal trial against the Ritz and Etoile. Trevor heard the news in Oswestry, and I have to admit I was pretty relieved. He didn't agree with the judge's blanket dismissal of the photographers. No photographers, no crash, he believed, but I accept the decision. Fayed's spokesman immediately declared that Fayed would appeal. It was a moment of humiliation for Fayed. His conspiracy theory had been dismissed as the rubbish Trevor and the lads had always believed it to be, and with his wild diatribes, his public reputation had sunk to that of a joke. Fayed had seen his own son blamed for putting Paul behind the wheel. The crash lawsuits expected to embroil Fayed grew more complicated in November, as the magazine Eurobusiness reported that Fayed and the Ritz's Frank Klein, not some third party as previously reported, were joint owners of a Etoile limousine. If the report was true, and now if the Ritz was sued, Fayed could not in turn sue Etoile as everyone had expected. Trevor reserves the right to appeal once he has read the judge's report, said Kirtle in the press release. Privately, he was urgently trying to persuade Trevor to ignore his qualms and protect himself by filing. Christian's most reliable press contacts had confided to him that Fayed planned not only to charge Trevor with criminal liability during the trial before the Court of Appeal, but to sue him in a civil court for negligence once the criminal case is over. They would never get Trevor to share their anxiety about Fayed, the 3 lawyers knew, yet the danger was real. If the triumph of winning a department store had led Fayed to gloat, "I piss on the British. I bought Harrods so I can sit up here and piss on them," it was hard to imagine what monumental establishment pissing an alliance between Doty and Diana would have inspired, with Fayed step-grandfathered to the heir of the throne. With that brief fantasy gone, Trevor could find himself with Fayed's epic frustration focused fully upon him. On the 7th of September 1999, Fayed filed his heralded appeal. Henri Paul's family filed the same day. Both left their appeals wide open, freeing them to charge anyone, any entity, with criminal liability. As soon as the judge announced a hearing date, they would be required to set out their appeal and name their charges. The lawyers believed that Trevor would likely be named. Despite himself, he might still be pulled into a legal war, but he had no desire to strike back. He would not appeal. He would not sue for damages in a civil court. Trevor was clear and firm about his decision. Personally, I think Fayed's made himself look stupid with these attacks and the extraordinary claims he's made. If I was with the boss now, I'd say, "Sod you, I'm not going to do anything I don't want to." Looking back on it, I don't owe Fayed or that organisation anything. But I'd be ashamed if I didn't feel some sort of moral responsibility. You wouldn't be human if you didn't. I'm the only person that survived. But it's not the so-called survivor guilt. It's the fact that I was paid to look after Doty and his guest, and they died on my shift. I've got this hanging over me for the rest of my life. But I tell you now, If it could have been me that died, and those 3 that survived, I would have done it. I really would. But you can't turn back the clock. You can't say, if only, if only, if only.